Hello. Right, hopefully everyone can hear me. Right, if everyone can hear me, we shall begin. Okay, right, excellent. People can hear me. Right, hello everybody. So, as this is the mid-month stream, of course, we are just taking questions straight from the chat. So, welcome to all of you who have shown up on this, well, what in the UK is a surprisingly mild and pleasant evening after having chucked it down with temporary thunderstorms as well. But, anyway, USS Grey Ghost. Hi, Drac. Would things have been worse for the Japanese if, during the ABDA command period, the US had had working torpedoes? Yes, not at the specific battles that ABDA command was involved in, because in none of those battles did US ships get close enough to launch effective torpedoes. They did launch some torpedoes, but they were out of range anyway, so it really didn't matter at that point whether or not the torpedoes were working, because they would never have hit anything. But if US torpedoes generally had been working, there were obviously a number of US submarines in operation, US aircraft in operation, and they were making torpedo attempts on Japanese shipping. So if the Japanese torpedo, the American torpedoes had actually been working, there would have been more Japanese casualties at that point, which obviously would have been bad for the Japanese and good for the Allies. Scooter JSP. At Dogger Bank, a German shell hits HMS Lion's command bridge and BT is killed. What are the immediate and post-war implications for the Royal Navy? So, that is a bit of a fun one. So, immediate implications. To be honest, Dogger Bank probably... Well, it depends exactly when he's being hit. So, if we assume that the hit comes in during the period where Lion's being shelled and being forced to drop out of line, then Dogger Bank will probably go slightly worse for the Germans, because with BT out of command, that means command will fall to another admiral or another senior officer, and then you're going to end up with people basically doing what BT ended up ruining, which is chasing off after the remaining German battle cruisers, and Seydlitz obviously is on fire. So Blucher will still go down. Probably New Zealand will deal with Blucher. With the confusion, possibly not a tremendous amount of... There wouldn't necessarily be further German losses, but their battle cruisers might well get further beaten up, because obviously the further on the British go, the further away they are from base, the closer the Germans are to their home. So at some point, with the commanding officer out of action, dead, they will break off. But I think that certainly there would be some rather seriously damaged German battle cruisers pulling in to port. Of course, British battle cruisers might also get badly hit as well, but the advantage was kind of with the British at that point, because Lion had been damaged enough to pull out of line, so had Blucher, but Seydlitz had also taken that turret hit, so overall the British had a slight edge at that point. Post-war is a lot more interesting, because they're going to have to find somebody else to serve as First Sea Lord. Jellicoe will have done his period as First Sea Lord, so that's going to be the interesting thing. Who is First Sea Lord at the time of the Washington Naval Treaty, and how good are they at swinging the political side of things? So yeah, that could be interesting. I mean, I'm not sure off the top of my head who exactly would take over. There's a couple of candidates, but with BT out of the picture, it could be a very difficult wave to working things out. Oh, wow! We're already having the skips of where the chat just jumps massively. Gregor Diesel asks, relatively complicated question about welding, and can I talk about ship manufacturing? So there is at some point going to be a Wednesday video covering, the construction techniques for ships, specifically looking at the differences between welding and riveting. So that's going to be that'll be quite an interesting and in-depth one, but there is a lot of there's a lot of detail to cover there. Right, so okay, right, so let's catch up with a few of the super chat questions quickly. Michael O'Brien asks, Night Battle of Guadalcanal, Yamato replaces Kirishima, with there being enough deep water for some maneuverability for Yamato. See, that could be a very interesting one, because at least on paper, Yamato's armour still won't quite resist Washington's 16-inch shells. The range is that close. But that is in theory and on paper, with taking into account that, you've got broadside on to broadside. As the minute that Yamato starts to yaw and make any kind of turn, there is a much greater chance of Yamato's armour actually rejecting those 16-inch shells. And of course, Yamato's face plate on her turrets, that will stop a 16-inch 45 shell at that kind of range. So Yamato will be more durable. She is still going to get hit quite badly. But, Kirishima did get a few salvos off at South... Well, she was firing on South Dakota before, but she did get a few more salvos off after Washington worked her over. So there's two aspects to it. One is that, Yamato firing, shore bombardment shells it'll mess South Dakota up, but it doesn't pose an existential threat to South Dakota. But once Yamato gets its AP shells going, AP hits to South Dakota could cause a lot more damage. So if you look at the hit that struck Barbette, the Barbette 3, the aft Barbette on South Dakota as it was leaving, if that had been an 18.1-inch AP shell, at the very least South Dakota would have lost that turret. Obviously the implications of a heavy armor-piercing shell penetrating a Barbette and exploding in the ammunition supply conduits and hoists are not really pleasant to think of, so I'll leave you to imagine the possible consequences there. But when it comes to Washington's engagement, it's going to be, I'd say, you're probably going to be 50-50 on whether Washington inflicts enough damage on Yamato that Yamato decides, better safe than sorry, and goes for the withdrawal, or if Yamato is able to just tank it hard enough to, just blitz on through and come out fighting. If Yamato is able to spot Washington and is still determined to fight despite the amount of damage she's taken, well then, 18.1-inch guns versus Washington's armor, which is weaker than South Dakota's, is not going to be a good thing. But Admiral Lee is going to be keeping on pouring in fire into South Dakota. So I certainly don't think... Well, Yamato's definitely not going to be walking away from that undamaged. Whether or not she manages to kind of overhaul South Dakota in the damage department or not, overhaul Washington in the damage department or not in time before Washington's own built-up levels of damage either cripple or sink Yamato is open to question. It's basically going to depend on who is getting the better hits in at that point, rather than anything else. And it could be a lucky hit either way. A lucky hit from Washington could cripple Yamato sufficiently that that's it. And a few lucky hits from Yamato could completely total Washington either way. Hello, Carl von Gazenberg and Dr. Clark. David... Oh, I forgot to put my phone on silent. David Stange? Stange, I don't know. Put that on Do Not Disturb. What do you think would have been the effect of a reliable rapid-fire 8-inch gun with a similar rate of fire to the 6-inch 47 on US and Royal Navy cruiser development and construction in the late 1930s? In the late 1930s, I don't necessarily think that there's going to be a tremendous effect on Royal Navy cruiser development, because they're well on the way with the Town class and then the subsequent Fiji-Crown Colony type. And yes, they're looking to bring back the heavy cruiser, and this kind of thing would probably prompt them to bring back the heavy cruiser a lot more. But late 1930s, even if they lay one down, even if they lay a class down, it's going to be a case of we've just laid it down just as World War II starts, which is not... They might be completed by 43-ish, probably. There's going to be a lot more priority on other vessels. And at that point, well, by mid to late 43, the kind of the naval war, at least in Europe, is pretty much... It's not done. There's certainly a threat from the Kriegsmarine, but the Regiermarine is out of the picture, and the bulk of the Kriegsmarine threat is contained to Norway, apart from the U-boats, and 8-inch cruisers don't really help you that much with U-boats. If it was the mid-1930s or the early 1930s, then I think Royal Navy cruiser development would be quite different. But for the US Navy, because they've got that extra couple of years of peacetime ahead, although they don't realise it at the time, obviously, then you might see a development of something like a Cleveland class with, instead of 666s, maybe twin 8s or something like that. Because one of the main reasons that the 6-inch gun was chosen for a lot of 1930s era treaty cruisers was the sheer rate of fire it could put out relative to the 8-inch gun, and the fact that you couldn't really armour that well against either of them if you were obeying the treaty limits. But if you've got an 8-inch gun that can fire just as fast as a 6-inch gun, well, then it makes sense to use the 8-inch gun instead, because it's going to hit harder per shell. So yeah, maybe an 8-inch Cleveland variant would be in the works for the US Navy. Frank Spazzato, how many cruisers could a battlecruiser battle if a battlecruiser battled cruisers? Yes. No, in all seriousness, it depends on the battlecruiser and the time period. So if you're talking about top-of-the-line armoured cruiser versus a battle cruiser, i.e. basically the Battle of the Falkland Islands, then you can see, well, from that the battle cruiser can comfortably take on one, maybe two, if it and before its ammunition starts to run low. Whereas if you're talking about, say, World War II, and you've got something like, say, HMS Renown, fully modernised, taking on treaty cruisers, or ostensibly treaty cruisers, then you could end up with, at that point, I think Renown could probably take on 3 or 4 quite comfortably, because it's got the speed to stay away from them, from most of them. There are a few cruisers that are fast enough to close the range if they absolutely have to, but the difference in displacement and firepower between a treaty cruiser and Renown is vastly, vastly greater than the difference between in displacement and firepower between, say, a Scharnhorst and an Invincible. 15-inch guns will wreck treaty cruisers very quickly. And Renown has the gunnery to make it hurt. Sorry, just copying out a couple more questions. So Martin One Blade is asking, I'd like to do a reaction episode of this for the 2nd Pacific Squadron on my podcast. As it's your content, I'd like your approval before I do it. Any thoughts? Yeah, just drop me a line on 5minuteguides@gmail.com or via Discord, and we can discuss it offline. Just make sure that we're both happy with how it's going to go. Yeah, in principle, I don't have a problem with it, but I just like to sort of have a quick discussion to double check. Sebastian Vadum, could you do a video about when the Germans tried to seize the Free French fleet during World War II? Well, you mean the Vichy French fleet at Toulon? Yeah, I can do that at some point. It's it's a thing of, yes, I will definitely do it. Exactly when is the list of Wednesday topics is very long. It's almost as long as the list of ships for the 5-minute guides. So, what's going on? All right, let's catch up with a few more of these. Oh my goodness, coming in thick and fast. So that's that one. Copy, copy, copy. All right. Galdir Ioni, what would be your dream casting for a movie or mini-series about Nelson? Oh, that's going to be an interesting one. See, Nelson is a very... if you're looking at a movie or mini-series... If you're looking at a mini-series, it's going to cover the life of Nelson, which means you're going to need multiple actors. Because Nelson at Trafalgar is a much older and very different man to Nelson at Cape St. Vincent, etc. And I'm not just talking about the fact he was gradually losing bits and pieces of his body on the way. He's also a relatively small man and relatively slightly built. So there's not that many Hollywood actors that will... there's not that many Hollywood actors that easily fit that bill, to be perfectly honest, because unfortunately, Hollywood likes the big, strong types. Thank you, Sean Adams, very much, as well as Big Al. So I don't know exactly who to cast. Off the top of my head, I'd say Tom Hiddleston wouldn't do a bad young Nelson. I'm not sure if you'd want him to play the older Nelson at Trafalgar, but he certainly could do a young Nelson very well, and that would be very important for a mini-series. Older Nelson, though. Older Nelson. Who could we put for older Nelson? Michael Fassbender might be able to do an older Nelson pretty well if Tom Hiddleston can't pull off the older Nelson. And I put Scarlett Johansson in as Emma Hamilton because, Emma Hamilton was supposed to be a drop-dead gorgeous redhead, so don't really have to do a tremendous amount of work casting Scarlett Johansson in that role. but then that's going to have to be a movie, because I doubt she's going to want to go into a mini-series. At that point, for the earlier part, when you've got people like Admiral Jervis and the various other older admirals who are kind of Nelson's mentors and guides going forward before he attains seniority, I mean, there's a whole smorgasbord of good older Hollywood actors you could pull in for that. I'd like to see Gary Oldman give it a shot. That would be quite amusing, as one of those senior admirals. The thing is that because of the way Nelson's career works, a lot of the officers and men that he interacts with are kind of transient. So there's very few people that are going to feature in significant chunks of his overall career. There'll be a few, but for most of them you could probably afford to go in with, well, because they're only going to be present, if let's say we're talking a miniseries, they're only going to be present for a few episodes or even one. You could either go for, maybe go all out, like, we're going to get this really famous guest star effectively in to be this person for one episode, or you could go the other way and go for, based on what we know of that person, we're going to go for a decent but relatively unknown actor who can play the part precisely to a T. Yeah, I think those would be the two ways I would go. I'm just going to check one particular actor's name. Oh yes, somewhere in there, somewhere in all of this, you've got to get Peter Firth. And for those of you who don't know, he played Captain Fitzgerald in the film Amistad. He does a very good Royal Navy captain, so you've got to get him in there at some point, either as an admiral or one of Nelson's more senior officers. Robert Luke saying Patrick Stewart. I don't know, who would we put Patrick Stewart in as? That's a good question. Patrick Stewart might do well as one of the governors or other senior people Nelson had to interact with at some point. Majin Vornbogen 12, which is apparently a name, asks, say Yamato makes her last trip, how effective as a shore fortification would she be, and how long to take her out? I think I covered this in a dry dock at one point a while back, but basically it comes down to who calls dibs on destroying her. If it's the Navy, or the Allied Navy as a whole, then you're probably going to be looking at a day or less, because if it somehow makes it into position, it's now completely stationary in the heart of, an area that the Allies were bombarding anyway. So you're just going to have lots and lots and lots and lots of ships queuing up to just batter her into submission. As I said, I think in that dry dock episode, it's kind of just erode the ship away, if nothing else. Whereas, given that she's on shore, the US Marines might decide they want to try the world's biggest boarding action, which might be quite interesting, shall we say, because yeah, I can see the Japanese trying to set off the magazines at some point if the Marines manage to blow their way in. So they'd have to effectively storm the ship quickly enough that the Japanese can't do that, which will be very difficult, because as I covered in that dry dock episode, storming a battleship with all its bulkheads locked up tight is actually going to be surprisingly difficult. Yorkie KDS, what would you say the 5 most important naval inventions were, and briefly why? Okay, so if we're going to talk about naval inventions as opposed to ship inventions, because something like the steam engine obviously is massively important, but you know, steam engines were put on civilian ships as well, so I wouldn't class them strictly as a naval invention. If we're going to look at purely naval inventions, or mostly naval inventions, then in no particular order, the rangefinder central fire director firing combo, because that moves gun ranges away from, close visual range for the first time. I mean, guns at that point are capable of firing much, 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 much further away, but it changes the entire paradigm of naval warfare. It sounds the death knell for secondary battery ships, or secondary, the pre-dreadnought style secondary, tertiary, etc. battery, because they can't range out far enough. It allows armor layouts to be completely revised, because you're now having to deal with, okay, powerful guns firing at long range, but you're talking about significantly fewer shells, and because there's no secondary fire, and also, even the big shells have somewhat less penetration power because they're having to go a lot further. So you can start concentrating the armor in basically what will eventually come to the all or nothing armor scheme. So that would be certainly up there. Then the torpedo, that is a huge, huge impact, because up until the invention of the torpedo, you have capital ships, and everything else below that is basically either some form of cruiser, whether the big armoured and first-class protected cruisers down to second- and third-class protected cruisers, and then you've got colonial stuff, sloops, gunboats, patrol craft. So, whereas once you introduce the torpedo, then all of a sudden you have torpedo boats, destroyers, and you now have the battle line potentially being able to be influenced not only by them, but also by cruisers, who also generally will have torpedoes, whereas before everything was dependent entirely on gun power. Beyond that, naval armor, armor plate is a very, very obvious one, because that requires guns to get fewer in number and larger, rather than as many guns as humanly possible. And for the final purely naval invention, although it's fractionally beyond the scope of the channel, normally I'd probably actually say the ship portable nuclear reactor, because the amount of changes that makes possible for not just things like supercarrier propulsion, but more especially for submarines, is a huge paradigm change compared to diesel electric type subs. Whiskey Delta Golf asks, Fisher gets to build 2 more Renowns instead of the 3 large cruisers, large light cruisers. Would the Royal Navy be in a better or worse place come World War II? A better place, significantly. Because if you've got 2 more Renowns, that means you've got 4 Renowns plus Hood, and you then have some options to play with. Because yes, okay, without the 3 large light cruisers, you're not going to get Courageous, Glorious and Furious as carriers, but there are options for how to develop a vessel that can follow that, that can become sort of stand-ins for those carriers. So you could try and say maybe convert and complete a couple of the Hood or Admiral class as carriers, and they fall into pretty much the same block categorization as the Lexingtons did with the Washington Naval Treaty. So you'd have 1 fewer carrier for the Royal Navy, but it would be, each of those carriers would be considerably larger and more capable than the large light cruisers. And when it comes to retaining ships, you are once you get to the London Naval Treaty, then at that, because Washington Naval Treaty, you'll be able to keep all your 15-inch gunships, but once you get to the London Naval Treaty and you have to ditch the Iron Dukes and Tiger, Instead, if you've got 2 Renowns sitting in there, you're probably also going to have to ditch 1 or 2 of the R's, which means if you're going into the war with, say, 3 R's, your 5 Queen Elizabeths, Hood, Nelson, Rodney, and 4 Renowns, well, 4 renowned type battle cruisers are going to be a significantly more capable force than 2 Renowns and 2 R's. In terms of convoy escort work, I don't think you'll see them there. What you'll probably see is Barham and Malaya will probably stand in for the R's in the quote-unquote missing R's in convoy escort work, but then these 2 Renowns are going to be standing in to where Barham and Malaya were historically, which means mostly the Mediterranean fleet, which opens up a lot of options for Cunningham, because then rather than Warspite being the one that charges around trying to do everything and the R's, the occasional R or old Queen Elizabeth tries to follow somewhere vaguely on behind, now actually Warspite is the one being outpaced by a couple of Renowns, which sets a much higher bar for the Royal Navy in the Mediterranean when it comes to engagements. Brian Richardson, if Yamato was designed to fight other battleships in multiples, wouldn't 4 twin turrets make more sense, as you'd be able to evenly divide a number of guns rather than 6 on one and 3 on the other? It does make a certain amount of sense, but you would overall be losing barrels. So if you look at because you lose 1 barrel, so 6 guns on 1 is quite good, but you'd be down to 4, so that's not good. Okay, you've got 3 on the other going up to 4, which is okay, but you're increasing the number of guns on one target by 1 and losing 2 on the other, so that's not particularly brilliant. Plus also the weight efficiency savings of having 3 triples versus 4 twins, as well as the shortening of the citadel, are factors. So you'd have to have, either to have similar levels of protection, you'd have to have Yamato be even larger and even more expensive, which might make it a problem to build, or you end up with thinner belt armor for a similar displacement, which is going to then mean it's actually considerably more vulnerable to being shelled by even standard class ships. So, yeah, in an ideal world, yes, you probably want 4 turrets for a Yamato that's going to take on multiple battleships, but within the context of what's going on with Yamato's construction, I'm not so certain. I don't think the capacity's there. Someone saying the answer is always Nick Cage. Yes, I'm sure. Aaron Ray says, silly time-travelling ships. What would happen if a bunch of time-travelling sailors took the Alaskas and Des Moines to the rear of Jellicoe's force during the fleet action at Jutland? What butterflies? So, well, they're US ships, so presumably they're going to be on side with Jellicoe. The first thing is going to be trying to make sure that the rear elements of the Grand Fleet don't shoot at them, because they're mysterious ships that have just shown up out of nowhere. But assuming they manage to get past that little identification issue, hopefully by flying some very large US battle ensigns, then the main strength that they're going to see above and beyond anything else is their radar, because it means that, well, if they're showing up during the main fleet action, so they're far too late to save any of BT's battle cruisers, and the fleet action ongoing, let's say it's the first engagement, so they can't really influence that either. But what they can do is track where the German fleet is going, which means when the Germans come back for the second round, which was the one which led to the death ride of the battle cruisers, they're going to see them coming. They're going to be able to tell Jellicoe that that's coming, so the British fleet will be slightly better prepared, and they will be able to dish out a mountain of pain. Radar-guided gunfire, especially with the Alaska's 12-inch guns, is going to make a complete mess of the German battle cruisers. The Des Moines guns are not too far behind in the ability to cause havoc, but if one or more of the commanding officers aboard that particular bunch of ships has read their histories, what will probably be the best approach for them would be for the Alaskas to take out the German battle cruisers and the Des Moines to smother the leading German battleships, crippling a few, and then basically allowing the rest of the fleet time to finish them off. And then, of course, at night, during the night action, if they're at the rear, then their radar's going to spot the Germans coming, and, well, if you've got 2 Alaskas and a couple of Des Moines sitting there in the darkness at several thousand yards range, just basically skeet shooting the Germans as they come across their field of vision, and the Germans have no idea what's going on. Basically, it would be a case of how many ships have we managed to sink. Well, that's going to depend entirely on how much ammunition we've got left. And of course, hopefully they'd be telling Jellicoe, the Germans are going that way, so what's left of the German fleet would be met at dawn. And to be honest, by that point, the Alaskas and Des Moines are going to be acting as scouts, because they will be out of main gun ammo by then. Thomas Vinton, have you ever considered the use and integration of naval artillery with various land conflicts with creators like Matimus, possibly a duo stream? Ever considered discussing the use of naval artillery? I could do. I'm always open for a collaborative stream, and that's the kind of interface that would be quite nice. I still need to talk to... I actually need to send Chieftain an email and ask him if he's happy to do a collab about tanks versus ships. Christian Slot Hulk. Late 42, Scharnhorst and Tirpitz versus a US Lexington battlecruiser and a Royal Navy G3, both refitted and modernised in 1939 through 41. Okay, so modernised Lexington, modernised G3 versus Scharnhorst and Tirpitz. I can't see the Germans coming out on top there, because I'm going to assume that during the refit and modernisation of a Lexington-class battlecruiser, the US would address the fact that it basically has nothing for armour. And they can do that because, given the sheer stupidly large engine spaces it was designed for, you could refit it with modern machinery that will keep up that level of armour protection. Keep up that level of speed and increase the armour protection quite substantially, because you'll be dropping a lot of dead weight in machinery, which would give you something that has a respectable degree of armour, and it's still got 16-inch guns, and it's now got radar-guided 16-inch guns, so its gunnery is going to be on a par with the Germans. And a refitted G3, again, similarly, if we look at Queen Elizabeth, Renown, Valiant's refits, so the G3 is already fast enough, as is the Lexington. In fact, both of them could afford to sacrifice even more of their machinery space and maybe drop down to 30 to 32 knots instead of 33 to 35 knots, respectively. And to save even more weight. The G3's already got plenty of armour. Doesn't really need any further upgrades to its armour thickness, although actually even the deck armour is pretty good. So that's probably going to mostly go into torpedo bulges or torpedo defences and secondary batteries and more radar and fire control. And the G3 is more heavily armed and more heavily armoured than Tirpitz is anyway. So although, basically Lexington with half decent armour, even if it's only 10 to 12 inches, will probably, with its 16-inch guns, probably make a mess of Scharnhorst in relatively short order. The G3 has an advantage over Tirpitz, and similar to the hypothetical Task Force 34 versus Admiral Yamamoto, once Scharnhorst is out of action, the Lexington can join in with the G3 against Tirpitz, and that's all she wrote. Galdi Yonai, if Austria gets proof the Italians are about to come into the Entente side a month early, can they try a preemptive attack against their navy? They could. It would be quite an impressive feat, though, because think about where the Italian navy is based at the time. The Italians would get reasonable enough warning. They might not get enough warning to get their fleet to sea, depending on what the readiness of the Italian fleet is. But they certainly would get enough readiness for the Italian ships to have all their guns crewed and manned, etc. At which point they would have some vulnerability because they're stationary targets, but equally they would also have spotting from the land to help with their range findings. So, yeah, the Austro-Hungarians I think the Austro-Hungarian Navy definitely could pull off a preemptive attack against the Italians within that month. How successful it would be is a completely different matter. Bill Anizari, which one is more effective, lattice versus tripod mast on the early 20th century capital ships? Tripods by a long way, as long as we're talking about the World War I and pre-World War I period. The lattice masts of that period fundamentally did not work. They were too lightweight, and they suffered from a lot of vibration issues for the fire control rangefinders on top. Now, as that progresses, once you get up to something like, say, the Colorados, those lattice masts are a lot more heavily built. They're less vulnerable to, just folding over like Michigan's did, and that being more heavily built also mitigates to a fair degree the complications and issues that they were having with vibration. However, by that point, they've become as heavy or heavier than tripods, which obviates one of their big selling points, which was supposed to be durability. Was supposed to be weight, and in the durability department, they're somewhat more durable than tripod masts, but they're also a bigger target than tripod masts. So the chances of them getting partially damaged and then either collapsing or having vibration issues show back up again is higher, just because they're easier to hit compared to the relatively spindly tripods. But they're functional enough. I'd say the Colorado class's lattice masts fundamentally are decent as platforms for fire control equipment. They just have some inefficiencies. The earlier ones, the tripods are clearly superior. And then weirdly enough, you get the lattice mast in a way re-emerging towards the end of World War II, except instead of being a circular one, it's now a square or rectangular profile lattice mast, which is now used almost exclusively to hoist radio aerials and radar systems, as opposed to big heavy rangefinders that need to be manned. Josh Thomas Moore saying, get Sean Bean to play all the ones that die. I have a feeling that I think Sean Bean now has a clause in most of his contracts that he's not allowed to die. T-Hawk 59, when did the British realise they would be passed as the largest navy, and how did they feel about it, and how did they respond? Some point in the middle of World War II. Probably, this is the funny thing, as I've mentioned before, in terms of when did the British even become the smaller of the two navies. The US and Royal Navies pass and surpass each other several times during the Second World War, because obviously you start out the war, Britain starts losing ships, the Americans aren't losing ships, but then the British start building more ships, although they're not going to come in, the big runs aren't going to come into service for a little bit. The Americans are obviously also building up forces, although not quite at the same pace that the British are, because the Americans aren't at war. So Britain goes slightly smaller, then bigger, then losses, etc., slightly smaller again, then Pearl Harbor, and they're much bigger again. Then you've got the somewhat rather interesting level of losses for the US Navy in 42. So the Royal Navy, I would argue, in 42 is still considerably larger, especially when you're looking at the larger capital ships. it gets a bit of a mess once you start looking at destroyer escorts and frigates and sloops and everything. But in the larger ships, definitely the Royal Navy is bigger, and then the US Navy kind of gradually overtakes in sort of 43 and going forward. There's a few more questions I need to copy. Da, da, da. Thomas Hobarth, how would the navies have looked without the Washington and London naval treaties? That, I mean, I've answered that question a few times in various I've answered that question a few times in various dry docks, but effectively you're going to be looking at the US at least. Well, the thing is, the government, the US government that was the one that authorized the building of the Lexingtons and the South Dakotas and had effectively opened the taps on naval funding, was a very different government to the one that was actually in power in the 1920s, thanks to an election. They were much more inward looking. They didn't want to spend the money. They could, obviously, if they really, really, really wanted to, but they didn't want to. And as I've said before, the British, again, they did have the money, in theory, for a naval building program, but they also had other things they wanted to spend it on. So you probably would have seen up to about the mid-1920s, Japan, US and Britain all in a building race. So you'd see the Lexingtons and South Dakotas, you'd see the next generation of US battlecruiser and battleship designs being laid down, you'd see the N3s and G3s and the subsequent next generation of British battleships being laid down, as well as Japanese equivalents to the Amagis and the Tosas and the Keys and whatever is going to come after them. But I think after that point, everything's going to start to throttle down quite considerably. For one thing, the Japanese are just going to flat run out of money, which is going to be interesting to watch. You've got, obviously, the Great Depression coming up as well, which is going to put a bit of a crimp on everybody's plans. And both the British and US governments are going to be very, 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 very annoyed with their navies at that point for spending a lot of money that they really want to spend on other things. So I think everything would slow down a little bit, because also by the mid to late 20s, the big scrappage schemes will have happened. So all the 12-inch gunships will be out of service. Some of the early 13.5 and probably 14-inch ships will be out of service as well. So there would probably be some kind of discussion in the late 20s if there wasn't a war. It's basically going to go one of those ways. There's either going to be a war or there's going to be a naval treaty. Or possibly both. Maybe one leads to the other. Enzo Venile. When will you make more videos about the Brazilian Navy? Besides Dreadnoughts, Agincourt and Parnaíba. When is an open question. There are a number of battles. There's a number of battles that I do need to cover for the Brazilian Navy, and there's a few other ships to cover as well. It's just a matter of time. Aaron Ray's offers a qualifier to his question. Okay, so for the Alaskas and Des Moines attacking the rear of Jellicoe's force, well, that basically will turn the Battle of Jutland into a German victory, because the British are looking entirely the wrong way, and the Alaskas and Des Moines can attack from out of the mist, so they can chew up the rear covering light forces pretty quickly, and then basically pincer Jellicoe's fleet as Jellicoe is aiming the other way at the Germans. The only real chance at that point that the British would have of turning around the turnaround would be if the Alaskas and Des Moines accidentally drift a bit too close, i.e. close enough to both be easily spotted and engaged, because if they do that, then at the rear of the British force is 5th Battle Squadron, who are probably one of the few sets of ships that have anything like the range and firepower to meaningfully respond. Obviously, they can be outranged by the Des Moines and the Alaskas, but if as I say, if they close a little bit too close, then neither the Des Moines nor the Alaskas are likely to withstand 15-inch gunfire particularly well. But that would require the American commander to make a mistake, or to be caught unawares by something. Harold Grundenjern: if the Fashoda incident in 1898 had broken out into a full war between the French and the British, how would the naval war have happened across the world? Lots and lots of small actions, because both sides have a lot of small cruisers, second and third class protected cruisers, and a few of the bigger ones as well, and some first and second class battleships wandering around. So you're going to have lots and lots of squadron actions, like 2 ships versus 1, 3 ships versus 3, all of that kind of thing, whilst obviously there's going to be a few big flashpoints, the Mediterranean, the Channel, etc. Overall, I mean, the French don't have anywhere close to the number of large ships, battleships and large cruisers that the British do in 1898. They're still kind of muddling their way through their early pre-dreadnoughts, trying to figure out how to battleship again after the Jeu Nicole. So, yeah, I mean, it's going to be a hilarious fight, because you're going to have the earliest pre-dreadnoughts plus this complete and utter wild range of ironclads fighting it out. So it's going to be a complete mess, and it's all going to be fought at point blank range. But fleet engagement wise, the British just have far too many ships for the Marine Nationale to realistically stand a chance against. But what happens elsewhere, well, across the planet, in all these various small ship actions, is going to be much more down to the individual commanders, because the odds in those engagements and the firepower present in those engagements is going to be a lot closer, and with point blank engagement ranges, anything could and perhaps would happen. Brendan McNamara, with this recent discovery of the USS Johnston earlier this year, from your point of view, what's the significance of the discovery, and do you think they'll find the other wrecks of Leyte Gulf? So they have found some. I mean, they found Chakai, for example, and a few others. As far as the significance of the discovery, I mean, one, it's USS Johnston, so that's fairly significant in and of itself. Second, Johnston is now, I think, officially the world's deepest shipwreck, so that is quite significant as well. It shows it shows, one, just how durable Johnston's design was, because it fell a long way through the water before it hit the seabed, and the wreck didn't immediately pancake. So that's good. Will they find the other wrecks? Possibly. Depends if they go back out and look for them in that area. I mean, there's not that many other important wrecks from Leyte Gulf to find now. They found pretty much almost all of the Japanese cruisers that were lost. They found Johnston. They could find the other US ships that went down, escort carriers and such like, but I have a feeling they're probably going to go looking on other battlefields first. Although it would be interesting. There's one or two of the escort carriers would be interesting to see. Jesse Estrada, thank you very much. Animal 16365, battlecruiser fight between Stalingrad and Alaska. I just need to check the Stalingrad battlecruiser's armament, because that is... I always get confused with the hypothetical Soviet battlecruisers, because one of them was effectively an equivalent to Alaska. The other one had bigger guns. Okay, yes, so the Stalingrad is the 12-inch gunned arm. So it's basically the Soviet equivalent of the Alaska versus the Alaska. At which point, oh yes, the Kronstadt's the bigger ones. Okay, the ones with the bigger guns. Okay, so if we're talking about Alaska versus Stalingrad, assuming that we're talking about the Alaskas staying around to the 50s, so that they can actually meet up with the Stalingrads, neither of them has the armor to withstand the other's guns at most of the ranges they'll be engaging each other. But I'd probably put money on the Alaskas having better fire control. So they are very much glass cannons, taking each other on, but Alaska's more likely to get the hits in first, so I would give that fight to the Alaskas. Sea Dodders. Would an all-big gun battleship be able to have been built earlier, say in 1890? Would it have been effective? And could anyone build a 20,000-ton vessel that could go at 18 knots? Could anyone build one? Yes, plenty of people could build a 20,000-ton vessel in 1890. I mean, they built a 35,000-ton plus vessel in the 1850s, that being the SS Great Eastern. So yeah, building a 20,000-ton vessel that could go at 18 knots is not going to be a massive problem in principle for most, for the big navies at least, in 1890. Cost-wise, much more of a problem. But in terms of it being effective, in 1890, probably not as effective as you think, because in 1890, you're still looking at a relatively slow rate of fire for the big guns, even compared to, the end of the 1890s. And you're also looking at a period, again, before centralized rangefinder-equipped central director firing, which means that the fight is taking place at a much, much closer range, which means the heavier secondary batteries, etc., potentially still have some benefit. And that's sort of the hail of fire doctrine, especially when paired with the slower rate of fire from your various... the slower rate of fire from your big guns. So, yeah, you could build an all-big gun ship in 1890 at 20,000 tons moving at 18 plus knots. But for the amount of money you'd be investing in it, it's not going to be as effective as the Dreadnought would be. I'd say probably the earliest that you could get a real revolution from building an all-big gun ship is probably the late 1890s, because if you build it just as long-range director firing is coming in, that means you've got the kind of second or third generation pre-Dreadnought's main guns, which can then actually exploit that range. You've also got Krupp armor steel coming in, which will allow you to actually armor your ship relatively well for that longer range gunfight. So yeah, late 1890s would be the earliest I'd say you bring in an all-big gun ship and make a significant difference. Smiling Nid, what ship in World of Warships is the most mistiered? Don't know, to be honest. I mean, I'd say Monarch is probably should be more of an equivalent tier 7 rather than It should be equivalent with the King George V's rather than being the Tier 8. But to be honest, I'm not certain. I'm not really sure on that, to be perfectly honest. It's been a while since I've looked through the whole thing, the whole lot. David Wright, how did warships account for roll and pitch of ships when engaging in naval gunfire? That was part of the central director firing system, gyro stabilized and everything. So yeah, because the guns are stabilized, the smaller guns can be stabilized enough to fire at pretty much any point, especially once power direction comes in. But the really big guns, the battleship guns, you can to a certain extent stabilize them, and you can keep them on target, but the ship is physically moving vertically, and you can't put the turrets on a sort of a big hydraulic stalk that moves up and down independently of the ship. So your systems will keep the guns pointing at the target, and that will account for your roll and your pitch, but in terms of the change in angle. But in terms of the vertical motion of the ship, you have the firing systems have to wait until the ship is either at an apex or in a nadir to minimize those kinds of effects. Then we've got Paul Brunner. 2 quick questions. As Admiral Drac, with current knowledge, assuming command at Pearl Harbor on November 1st, 1941, what action do I take? I would send messages to Enterprise to launch its entire fighter complement and come in at a time and place of my choosing. But more to the point, I would have everybody drilled ready at action stations, have all the ships locked up, all watertight bulkheads sealed, boilers ready to go, so that if necessary they can break from their positions and move out. I mean, I'd also have torpedo nets and all sorts of other improvised anti-torpedo defenses positioned. And as well as having everyone at action stations, all the anti-aircraft guns ready to go, I would be trying to make sure all the US Army Air Force fighters and such like are in the air, because I know where everybody's coming from, so I would send a whole bunch of fighters to intercept the Japanese strike, and then have the anti-air gunners clear up whatever's left, and then that deals with the first wave. And then that's why Enterprise launches its fighters as well, because then Enterprise's fighters hopefully come in and break up the second wave, and then my anti-aircraft gunners deal with what's left of the second wave. And then, what Axis ships do you think USS Arkansas could face off against and survive? Anything that isn't a Scharnhorst or a Bismarck, or a Littorio. Arkansas versus a Conte de Cavour or Andrea Doria would be an interesting one, because they've been modernized. Arkansas hasn't been to the same degree, and it's a lot slower, so yeah, I would say basically as long as Arkansas stays away from Axis battleships, anything else up to and including a Panzer ship Arkansas can deal with quite happily. But in a one-on-one sort of knockdown, drag-out fight, because it hasn't had anything like the upgrades that either the modernised Congos, Andrea Dorias, and Conte de Cavours have had, it's smaller and less well-armed than something like Bismarck, Littorio, Nagato, or Yamato, you just want to keep it away from the Axis capital ships. Miles McCaskill, Scharnhorst versus Alaska. That's another one I've answered in the dry dock a few times. And once again, it comes down to, well, Scharnhorst has slightly smaller and significantly less powerful guns than Alaska, but it also has much heavier armor. So Alaska doesn't really have the armor to meaningfully reject Scharnhorst's guns anyway, but it does have the firepower to hurt Scharnhorst at a fairly long range. So I think my previous assessments of that particular fight have basically been, at short to medium ranges, Alaska probably has the edge, but at longer ranges, Scharnhorst armor should be able to protect it from some of Alaska's fire, whereas the reverse is definitely not true. So slight advantage to Scharnhorst if you run it like 10 to 100 times or something like that. Richard Andrew Swain asks, if Isoroku Yamamoto had survived the war, what do you think would have happened to him? Probably something similar to what happened to Admiral Raeder and Dönitz. I mean, I can see the US possibly trying to make a big issue about Pearl Harbor and it being a surprise attack and everything, but yeah, I don't think that he would be put on quite the same pedestal for, retributive action at trial as other officers and political people like, say, Goering. Yeah, I think Yamamoto would probably end up facing a similar situation to someone like Raeder or Dönitz at trials. He might get a slightly harsher hearing and therefore more consequences because of some of the conduct of the Japanese Navy under his command, with reference to things like machine gunning prisoners in the water and such, and of course, trying to make something of a bigger deal about Pearl Harbor, but that's going to be a little bit... I don't think he'd face dramatic consequences. Rebel Skverl asks, along the lines of fictional warships such as HMS Thunderchild, could you do a video about the possible specs of the Bruce Partington submarine from the Sherlock Holmes story of the same name? I'd have to look into it first and discover what the heck the Bruce Partington submarine is. That might make a decent April Fool's at some point. Then we've got Yusrael pointing out that the problem with the surprise attack argument is the Japanese declaration was meant to arrive before the attack started. The Japanese embassy messed up. The thing is, Yamamoto was ordered to... I mean, I know I was just following orders. It doesn't actually make much of a difference in the post-World War II trials, but he was a military officer doing a military operation. He's not responsible for whether or not the Japanese diplomatic corps have got their ducks in order. To be honest. Mark Bass. HMS Warrior 1860 versus HMS Gannet versus USS Olympia. Olympia's going to win that one. Easily. Warrior doesn't have the firepower to hurt Olympia's protective system. Olympia's guns can certainly penetrate Warrior's armor, and Gannet is a composite sloop. It doesn't have any armor. Okay, granted, it's got slightly heavier guns than Warrior. I mean, some of it's the same. Some of it's the 64-pounder guns are the same, but it's got fewer than Warrior, so it's actually got much less firepower. It's got a couple of 7 inches. But, all things told, the fact that Gannet just flat out doesn't have any armour and also has much fewer guns means it's at the very bottom of the pile. But Olympia is just far and away above the other two. Andreas Pearson, think we'll hit 5 hours tonight. Well, I haven't yet finished my first glass of Iron Brew, so we shall see. Daniel Silverthorne, how different would the Mediterranean theatre had been had the Kriegsmarine taken over authority of the Regiomarine when the Italians joined the war? Depends which Kriegsmarine officer gets put in charge. I mean, it's too late to do anything about the Shell situation, really, unless they're really, really, really determined and pick up the issue, which they might not do. But, yeah, it depends entirely who they put in. If they... I mean, I'll take two contrasting officers to give you an idea. If they put Admiral Lütjens in charge of the Regia Marina instead of sending him off with Bismarck, frankly, I don't see them doing spectacularly better. Whereas if you were to take somebody very competent and aggressive, like Admiral Marshall, for instance, and put him in charge in place of, say, Admiral Iachino, yeah, then the Regia Marina might have done considerably better, because Marshall was a very competent, very aggressive officer, whereas someone like Lütjens or Bay, not so much. Night Heron Productions. Vanguard has a 1950s rebuild in the USA. It gets 16-inch guns and is still deployable for the Falklands in 82. How interested would the Reagan administration be in potentially leasing it after that? Excuse me. If Vanguard goes over to the Falklands and has merry fun with the Argentine Air Force with radar-directed anti-aircraft batteries, I mean, first it's a question of whether or not the Royal Navy would even want to lease it to the Americans. But assuming that, I don't know, they still decide to do Royal Navy budget cuts and Vanguard gets put aside and also is not allowed to be a museum ship, or if it's got 16-inch guns and it's been modernized either before or after the Falklands, I don't know about leasing. The Reagan administration might try buying it, I guess, if the British are interested in selling. But I have a feeling the British would probably either want to keep it around in active service or turn it into a museum ship if they're taking it out of service. But the main stumbling block for that is in the aftermath of the Falklands War. Given that they cancelled the sale of Invincible to Australia, I do find it somewhat difficult to believe that the British would even want to let it go in the first place. And some of the other stuff with like the machinery being different and so forth might dissuade the US Navy, even if it has the same 16-inch guns. Alexander Stubbs, what were the British captains supposed to be doing with their conning towers? Well, officially, according to doctrine, they were supposed to be in them. But they just decided, no, we're not going to. So, yeah. Chazek asks, if the reality of the Samar Task Force 34 video had occurred, what would the implications be for the rest of the war? And would Admiral Lee be known as the next Nelson? Admiral Lee would be known as, probably become one of the most famous US admirals, because one, he would be the US admiral with the most kind of one-on-one kills, if you like. He would have been the US admiral who sank the most battleships. He would have been the only US admiral to lead a US battle line in anything close to approaching a fair fight. I mean, obviously, Admiral Kincaid on the same night has, executed the Japanese Southern Force, but that wasn't really anything close to a fair fight. So yeah, Lee has basically led the modern US Navy in its one and only, at that point, full-on gun-based fleet action. So he's going to be incredibly well known. And the fact that, assuming that that particular scenario goes off, and bear in mind, when I did that scenario, I was trying to pull a reasonable absolute worst case for Admiral Lee, because there's all sorts of changes and modifications you can do to make things more favourable for the US Navy. In that scenario, there's not a tremendous number of changes you can make further to the Japanese that are in any way really plausible. Maybe like Musashi magically somehow survives because a storm takes out the American strike at Sibuyan Sea, but that's getting well onto the implausibility side of things. But yeah, would he be known as the next Nelson? Possibly not quite that high, because whilst it would have been a spectacular battle, it's not the kind of course of the war changing battle that Trafalgar was. But yeah, he would certainly be up there as one of the greatest admirals of all time for, consistent results in gun actions. I don't know what that discussion about the Queen Elizabeth class is about, but I'm sure someone will tell me. The Legacy asks, if forced to join a navy, but you had the choice of which navy and era, which navy and era would you join and why, both as a historian and as a sailor? As a historian, I'm not sure. As a historian, I'm tempted to say possibly the Napoleonic era Age of Sail, because there's for such a commonly known period of naval history, there's an awful lot of things that we don't know that I really would like to know, and would be furiously writing notes to my future self about. Things like, what colour were the French and Spanish ships actually painted at the Battle of Trafalgar? And yeah, I mean, obviously the thing is, the two world wars, I've no guarantee of exactly where I'm going to end up. Whereas as a sailor, probably the mid-19th century, because that's when navies are really doing a lot of exploration. There's kind of two phases to it. You've got the era of sort of Captain Cook and other similar like-minded naval officers pre the Napoleonic Wars who are going off doing all sorts of fun things like discovering Australia, and then you've got the mid-19th century naval explorers as well. I think as a sailor, I'd like to go to one of those eras to, literally see new parts of the world that no one has seen before at that point. But as a historian, yeah, I'd either be in the Napoleonic era to clear up a lot of irritating issues, or possibly in the latter part of the 19th century to take photos of all the ironclads that no one seems to have taken decent photos of. Okay, that's done that. Grim Death says, Center Force under Raizo Tanaka, how do you think it would have gone? Tanaka would have done a lot better job than Kurita, but to be honest, Tanaka would probably be quite happy commanding everything from destroyers. How else would Tanaka? I mean, I think Tanaka would, apart from anything else, Tanaka would have insisted absolutely on at least some fighter cover. So Sibuyan Sea probably would have gone very different. Wadzi, I think. How would you consider making videos about Cold War era ships? As I've said before, no, my expertise when it comes to naval history and ships in particular stops fairly sharply post 1950 in terms of being able to give you absolute chapter and verse about the ship's capabilities, and I have said that before. I'm going to make an exception with bilge pumps, but bilge pumps is very much opinion, and a lot of the time we're looking to future and current events and parallels to the past rather than discussing precise capabilities. But for things like the 5-minute guides, I don't know enough, and there's too many details that are still classified for Cold War era ships. The only exception that I would make for the Cold War era generally is if I was making a video that was either mostly by, i.e. an interview, or heavily checked by someone who was actually there. So obviously I did the interview with Captain Sequest, and hopefully we'll be doing one or two more with him. I mean, that I really enjoyed that, as you could probably tell from the video. And he was there. He was the one who did the naval service. He was the one who's providing the information. So I'm perfectly happy for that, because he's the one giving the information. He knows what he's talking about. When it comes to 1980s Iowa-class battleships, I don't. I don't think many people would know compared to Captain Sequest, but I definitely don't. And if I was going to do a 5-minute guide to a post-1950s era vessel, it would have to be, I think, talking to someone who has served aboard that ship and knows a lot about that type of ship, who would be able to then say, oh yes, this is right, this is wrong, etc., etc. And it would be a very limited thing, because obviously that's involving a lot of work by somebody else to get all the details correct. So theoretically, but not as a regular thing, and not based on my expertise. Whiskey Delta Golf, if Germany took all of France's capital ships in 1940, how would they have been best used, and what could the Royal Navy have done to counter them? It's a bit of a difficult one, because one of the things that nobody except perhaps the Kriegsmarine themselves really appreciated, and that includes the British, they didn't realise this either, the Germans didn't have a lot of naval fuel oil. So massively, this was one of, if not the primary reason, the Kriegsmarine themselves weren't fantastically enthusiastic about picking up the French fleet once they'd stopped to think about it. Initially, there were some rumblings about possibly doing so, but the main problem they have is they don't have the fuel really to fuel their own fleet, let alone adding France's fleet to it. What they could have done is use them as a reserve replacement for certain ships. So they could have taken some of the pretty good French light cruisers and used them instead of the Königsbergs. They could have used some of the French destroyers to make up for the losses in the Norwegian campaign. As for Richelieu and Jean Bart, well, if we're just talking about the capital ships, you've got Dunkirk, Strasbourg, Richelieu, and Jean Bart. Jean Bart's probably not going to be complete in anything like any kind of reasonable time for it to be of a practical use. Richelieu might be. Dunkirk and Strasbourg obviously already are. If they've ended up with Dunkirk and Strasbourg, would probably make very good partners for Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, like on Operation Berlin. Those four operating together would be able to overcome single old battleships that are escorting convoys. So that would be probably the best use for them. As for what the Royal Navy could have done to counter them, it would be very difficult. I don't think you'd have the Eastern Fleet, for example, because the Royal Navy's got to keep enough ships in the Mediterranean to keep the Italians pinned down, except now they're going to have to be operating like a couple of capital ships, including probably a modern-ish one, on every convoy when there's a chance of the sort of Franco-German capital ship fleet sailing. The main thing is going to be, as I say, that each of those operations is going to burn through a massive amount of fuel oil for the Germans, which is actually probably going to overall limit their operations. Although it doesn't mean there's going to be a very, very high concentration of Allied capital ships when what's left of the Franco-German capital ship force eventually holds up in Norway. Yeah, CRQ basically making the same point with the fuel. Charles Wade, the Russian version of the MTB, the G5, have you done a video on it? Nope, not yet. Master Tease, Her Majesty's Great Machine Gun Minotaur design versus USS Worcester. Minotaur's probably going to win that, not particularly because of any massive element of ship design, but purely because the British 6-inch autoloader took slightly longer to jam than the American one did. It's kind of the story of both the autoloading 6 and the autoloading 3-inch weapons that were developed at the end of World War II and into the early 1940s. The British and the American design share a lot of commonality because, well, a lot of parts are common, but all of them jammed and had issues with jamming. It's just for whatever reason, the American ones tended to jam slightly more often and slightly faster. So in a Minotaur versus Worcester fight, Minotaur's guns are just going to be, in service just that fraction longer, which means they're going to get more shots off, or they can kind of, you could fire Minotaur's guns for as long as Worcester's guns fire, then Worcester's guns jam, you stop firing Minotaur's guns before they jam, let them cool down a bit, and then keep firing. Stephen Laguerre, thank you very much. Stephen Laguerre there, he's a retired senior chief of the US Navy. And obviously I appreciate everyone who tunes in and listens and views, but I must say, when I see people who have actually, they've done being in the Navy for a living and they appreciate the channel and the work that I do, it's that little extra special thing, because say I'm a naval historian, I can study this, I can talk to you all about it, but I haven't served in the Navy, and therefore I can't give you that kind of direct experience. So when there are people who have done it as a job, say, yeah, I like this, you're doing a good job, it's like, yes, I'm doing something right. Huzzah. Coltax 100, which navy was the most successful, Japan, Germany, or Italy? Successful how? None of them won, obviously. If you define success in number of Allied ships sunk, the Japanese, if you define success in terms of greatest number of ships, greatest number of their own ships still around at the point at which they put their hands up and said, okay, we give up, the Italians. Because the Italians didn't actually lose any capital ships until after they bowed out of the war. Because Conte de Cavour, okay, after Taranto, it wasn't ever fully repaired, but it wasn't sunk. They were in the middle of repairing it, so it's not fully lost. And Roma was blown up on its way to Malta after the Italians had officially bowed out of the war. So yeah, in terms of enemy ships sunk, the Japanese um, in direct naval combat, not including merchant shipping. If you're looking at impact on enemy merchant shipping, obviously the Germans with the U-boats, but in terms of brought most of our sailors home, the Italians, because they lost less less than the Japanese and the Germans did. Um, doo, doo, doo. One last cast. I don't know where exactly to look. Anyone know where he got the picture behind him? That's one last cast asking. I did link it in, and a couple of other people linked it in a previous live, a couple of lives back. I'll have to put it up somewhere at some point permanently. Peden Harley, at the moment of first contact at the Battle of Jutland and Samar, BT's battlecruiser fleet and 5th Battle Squadron and Thomas Sprague's 3 Taffy groups switch places. Taffy 3 in contact, 1 and 2 in distant support. What happens? Taffy 3 probably gets taken apart very quickly and horribly because they're in gun range of the German battlecruisers and there's a lot of them. And whilst they might be momentarily perplexed by what the heck are these things, there's no way that Taffy 3 has the speed to get away. Johnston et al. Will probably land a number of nasty torpedo hits on the German first scouting group, and Taffy 1 and 2 with air support and radar equipped escorts will work the Germans over something really nasty as the day goes on. But Taffy 3 is going to take quite the pasting. Although seeing once Johnston and company have fired their torpedoes off, bearing in mind that they can drop smoke and hide in it whilst firing, that's going to be incredibly irritating for the small torpedo boat destroyers that the Germans use as scouting craft, because they can just pick them off without the Germans really being able to respond. Cow to face. German naval commanders German naval commanders in World War II who would have been more effective if they'd been on the Allied side and had access to their resources. Spee and Hipper. Admiral Hipper, if Admiral Hipper was on the Allied side and in command of the battlecruiser fleet, he would have done so much better than Beatty. Admiral von Spee was reputed to be a very good admiral and did have seniority. Obviously, he showed a very good understanding of tactics and his enemy's strengths and weaknesses at Coronel, but obviously didn't get a chance to show his full operational range of ability because of the Battle of the Falkland Islands. But yeah, I mean, almost by inference, if von Spee had been on the Allied side and had access to Allied resources, then he wouldn't be at the Battle of the Falkland Islands, so automatically he would have been more effective because he would have lived. But yes, Hipper definitely would have. I mean, yeah, Hipper in charge of the battlecruiser fleet. That's kind of the combination of the best commander of battlecruisers who actually had a chance to command battlecruisers in World War One, and he now has the resources of the battlecruiser fleet and 5th Battle Squadron on his hands. Ryan Friedrich. Were there any battleship designs, obviously never built, that envisaged employing super firing main turrets, a la the Atlanta-class cruisers? Yes, there were. A disturbingly large amount, actually. couple of the designs for HMS Dreadnought that were considered involved triple stack super firing twin 12-inch turrets. At one point, I think there's a design for North Carolina back when it was quad 14s that has triple stack Nelson style, i.e. all forward quad 14s, if I remember correctly. So yeah, there's actually quite a worrying number of battleship designs throughout the Dreadnought era where people thought triple stacking main gun turrets was a good idea. And I mean, Yamato's almost there with that little quirky little 666 sitting high up behind the other two main turrets, but it's not really a main battery turret, to be fair. Code Monkey asks, Alaska versus California pre-Pearl Harbor fitting out. Notice I spelt harbour the British way. So, I mean, if we're talking pre-Pearl Harbor refit, then Alaska's going to win because Alaska has, long-range radar-guided fire control and California doesn't, which means Alaska can just choose the time of the engagement to suit it because it's faster, and then just sit at that long range and start chucking shells downrange. Cody85, how effective would pneumatic cannons based on the guns from the dynamite cruiser be as an anti-submarine weapon, and how would this have changed naval design? I guess you could use them to throw some pretty big depth charges a fairly long way. But their main advantage at that point is going to be the distance. But the thing is, the distance only really matters if it's not backwards, because if it's backwards, you might as well just shove the things off the back and it's done. So a pneumatic cannon, sort of a 15-inch pneumatic cannon as an anti-submarine weapon, really only works in World War II once you have ASDIC or sonar, and you can then use it as a kind of giant hedgehog thing. So you can then launch very heavy depth charges quite far forwards, which that actually might help quite a bit. How it would have changed naval designs, well, the thing is you still need a fairly large installation, so it would be installed probably on larger specialist anti-submarine escorts, but I don't see it having much more application outside of that. Atheist 3, do you have any plans for a video on the mutiny of the High Seas Fleet? I imagine there was a lot going on behind the scenes. I'd like to, but whilst there is a fair amount of information in English about the High Seas Fleet mutiny, some of it is contradictory, and I get the feeling there's probably a lot more in German. So if I do end up doing that video, I will probably have to Shanghai probably military history visualized into helping me with that, because he can actually read German. I mean, I technically can, but not very well and to a very basic high school level, and given that at that time in history they really seemed to be in love with the Gothic font, I just kind of throw my hands up and go, I give up when it comes to trying to read a lot of German stuff. The Legacy says, you've made a meme out of the story of Kamchatka. Yes, somehow. I mean, really, Kamchatka kind of made a meme out of itself. I'm just kind of there to tell it. Even if there is now furious argument over exactly which parts of Kamchatka's tale were accurate and which parts were exaggerated, with everyone pointing, this way and that at different sources that, there are some period sources that say Kamchatka did do these things. There are other period sources that say that it didn't, and or that it did something, but it was for a different reason, or it didn't go quite as badly as other sources say. But this is the problem with subjective sources when it comes to the voyages of the Second Pacific Fleet. Someone might look at something and go, this was really, really bad. Another person might be going, well, yeah, this happened, but maybe it wasn't quite as bad as that. Whose opinion do you take? I mean, in the end, Kamchatka ended up sunk, so does it? I don't think it matters massively, but other people may disagree. Certainly, I mean, the thing is, Kamchatka did do an awful lot of odd and dodgy things. There is a reason that Rozhesvensky was absolutely furious with the thing and was throwing binoculars at it at a disturbingly high rate. And it's like, Rozhesvensky isn't going to be doing that unless there is a lot to vent about. Todd Webb. I'm trying to keep up with the super chats, Todd Webb. I do apologise if I've missed yours. Let me just check, because the Legacy is sending me them as well. So let me just double check. Dun, 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 dun. I did miss that one, Todd Webb. Oh yeah, there were a couple I missed there. Sorry about that. Let me just grab those. Martin One Blade asks, the anime Zipang is about a time-travelling Japanese Aegis destroyer going back into World War II. Any thoughts? Here's my thoughts. I mean, come on, it's an Aegis destroyer in World War II. What do we think is going to happen? I think I've seen a few clips of that, but yeah, that's not the particular scenario I'm massively interested in, because there's not really many ways to write that aren't either look hilariously overpowered or hilariously unrealistic. I mean, apart from time traveling Aegis destroyer. Todd Webb's question was, if the High Seas Fleet and Grand Fleet had been of the same relative numbers, but the gun size situation was reversed, how different would Jutland be? Okay. Ooh, sorry, let's just copy those quickly. Okay. Whoops. Right, so yes, anyway, we were talking about relative numbers, but the gun size situation reversed. How different would Jutland be? With respect to the battlecruiser engagement, quite a bit different, because if the German ships are going around with 13.5-inch guns, then the belt armour hits to various British battlecruisers that their armour stopped wouldn't have been stopped, so the BT would have taken a lot heavier losses. As far as the main fleet engagements and also 5th Battle Squadron would have taken a lot more of a heavy pounding, but in terms of the main fleet engagements, it doesn't change all that much, because whilst the British guns are doing slightly less damage and the German guns are doing slightly more damage, in order to do that damage you have to actually hit, and the German battleships only ever scored, well, I think the German battleships maybe scored one hit. I think most of the capital ship, the very, very few hits on the British battleships, I think were mostly attributed to Seydlitz. But basically the Germans don't really hit the Grand Fleet all that much really at all. whereas whereas when you look at the reverse is not true. Basically, it's the maneuver of Jellicoe crossing the T twice. The Germans are going to retreat from that no matter if the gun sizes are switched. So most of the difference is going to be in the battle cruiser engagement and 5th battle cruisers fight as well. Modern 6292, besides the Iowa class, has any other ship class been entirely preserved? Think. I mean, Victory technically is a one-off, so technically yes. Avarov is also technically a one-off. I mean, yeah, it's a Pisa class, but it's a customized one. So yeah, there's a few ships that are one-offs or near enough unique. So so yeah, but no, in terms of his ships where there were multiple ships in a class, I don't think there's any other ship that's had its full class preserved. Picking up on the rest of the Legacies question, is there a ship out there that is even more infamous and meme-worthy than Kamchatka? Of warships, I don't think so. It's just the ongoing series of hilarious failures that is Kamchatka. Colin Cameron, can you do a video on HMS Troutbridge? It is, after all, the Royal Navy ship with the highest number of friendly sinkings. I don't know if that's Troutbridge or Truebridge. I can add it to the list. Geldir Ioni, 40k does World War II. Which 40k faction plays the role of which historical side? Who gets to play the Orcs, i.e. obviously the best side? That's a bit of a loaded question. Okay, well, throwing aside any full on throwing aside any full on like historical similarities of any way, shape or form, and just going with kind of the more meme worthy side of things, it's like, well, let's think. Ain't much sort of had a very large empire and much older than almost everybody else, attitude of superiority, so the British are going to be the Eldar. Communists in space, so the Tau are obviously going to be the Russians. Who else have we got? Modern, armoured and determined to kill everything in sight, so Space Marines are going to be the US. Maybe the Imperial Guard, because they do have the Endless Hordes thing going as well. So yeah, the Imperium is probably going to be playing the US. Don't know who the Necrons would play. Cranky, ancient, technologically advanced, trying to murder everything in sight. Might as well play the Germans. Crazy running around, don't particularly care if they die. I mean, okay, fair enough. The Orcs, might as well put the Japanese in the role of the Orcs, because the only one other major faction you've got left is the Italians, which leaves them with what? The Dark Eldar? Oh, no, I don't think the Italians are going to be played by the Dark Eldar. I don't know who the Italians would be played by. Maybe one of the sub-factions. Yeah, well, I'm just going for the meme side of things because yeah, there's a lot of stuff that doesn't make sense in that kind of scenario. Anyway, K-Wolf X, tell us about dye markers to identify shell splashes. When did it start? Who used it, and was it effective? The idea started. Actually, the very first ideas of using dye markers for shell splashes actually predate World War One, but in terms of actually effectively putting it into service, you're talking about late 1910s, early 1920s. As far as who used it, almost every navy experimented with it at one point or another. By the time of World War II, the Japanese and the French were the main users of it. In terms of whether or not it was effective, well, the Battle of Samar talks about all sorts of fancy colour shell splashes going off all around it, but the main thing is the dyed shells or dye in the shells was mainly designed to help differentiate the shell splashes of multiple different capital ships when they were all firing in a mass engagement, kind of like Jutland, which never really happened. So judging the effectiveness of dyed shells in the engagements that they were designed for is very difficult, because the circumstances they were built for never happened. Paul Hurst, what if Force Z had been ordered to join what was left of the US Pacific Fleet for the duration of the Pacific War? That's an interesting one. Well, for one thing, they wouldn't have gone to Singapore. They would have gone across the Atlantic through the Panama Canal and over towards Pearl Harbor. And if that happens, then, well, that basically means, well, somewhere along the way, someone's going to stick an awful lot of Oerlikons and possibly some Bofors on Prince of Wales and Repulse, at which point the US now has a pair of fast capital ships right at the start of the conflict. So Prince of Wales and Repulse will probably end up riding escort for US carriers for the bulk of the war. Now, the interesting thing is actually be early in the war. Do they run escort for the Doolittle raid, or do they run escort for Lexington and Yorktown at Coral Sea? Because I can see an argument the US making that we've got these fast capital ships, we're running up close to the Japanese coast, we're very worried about what might happen to them, let's put some fast capital ships with them just in case the Japanese come out. But at the same time, you've also got to account for the fact, with a little bit of hindsight, that they don't know, that what they don't know, but we do know, is that they're probably going to be more useful at Coral Sea. Because if you've got two extra big anti-aircraft batteries, well, one, they might attract some of the Japanese aircraft, but two, with that extra AA, they might break up enough the Japanese attacks enough that you end up with possibly Lexington surviving, which would be quite interesting. Damn, Daniel, do you ever plan on doing a video on Japanese Navy crew accommodation? Probably not a long one. I might mention it at some point, but it's not something that I think merits a half-hour video. Mark Bass, USS Olympia versus HMS Caroline. Caroline's probably going to win that because it has better fire control because it's much newer and faster. So yeah, that's a bit of a time. I know Olympia was in service with somewhat different armament by that point, but Caroline is just flat out faster, and yeah, with generally better fire control, that's going to take it. Right. Thank you very much, Michael Bergman. Richard Orter, dreadnought ships came after World. If dreadnought ships came after World War One, not prior to it, what ships are built instead of or cancelled, altered for other roles, and how does this change World War One and Two? It's not going to change World War to all that much, except for the fact of possibly there being, you know, a lot of modernised pre-dreadnoughts. Or, to be honest, actually, if dreadnoughts are just coming about, since pre-dreadnoughts are cheaper to build, and you're somehow artificially stopping everyone from building all big gun battleships, the naval treaties might not come about until later. But what ships are built instead? Well, look at the last generation of pre-dreadnoughts, really. That's going to be... I mean, that's the upper limit, really, that you can go to before going on to the all big gun ships. Ships like the Lord Nelson with 9.2-inch secondaries, the Satsumas with 10-inch secondaries. You're going to have, like, effectively big armoured cruiser gun level massed secondaries. Unless someone really wants... If you really, 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 really want to play rules lawyer and cheat, you could go with something like the Kawachis with different caliber guns of the same size except on the wings. So like 50 caliber guns on the center line and 45 caliber guns also of like 12 inches or 13.5 inches or whatever, apart from the fore and aft. So yeah. World War One will be more interesting because if you're still artificially limiting everyone to pre-dreadnoughts, then that means something like Jutland is going to be just masses and masses and masses of pre-dreadnoughts wandering around, wondering what the heck is going on. Nosdormu 89, why were fourth-rate ships of the line considered obsolete by the 1750s? Basically, they didn't have enough guns compared to third rates, second rates, and first rates. Third rates were becoming a lot more common, and also critically, the fourth rates almost entirely had 24-pounder lower gun decks and then either 18 or 12-pounder upper gun decks, whereas a lot of third rates had 32-pounder lower gun decks and then sometimes 24, usually 18-pounder upper gun decks, which meant that although the third rates only had a few more guns on the broadside than the fourth rates, they had a considerably heavier firepower. And between the somewhat greater size and the considerably greater firepower and their proliferation, the fourth rates just didn't have the wherewithal to stand in line. Excuse me. Stand in the line of battle at that point. Matt Clem, at what point during World War II did manpower shortages begin playing a factor on new ship construction for the major navies, if at all? For the British, very early on. One of the reasons, I mean, apart from the delays in the 16-inch guns, one of the reasons Lion and Temeraire were cancelled and broken up relatively quickly was, in part, worries about manpower shortage to complete them. Vanguard was first delayed from starting and then delayed in construction because there were manpower shortages in the yard that she was being built in. Implacable was being built nearby, and a lot of workers were needed to finish her, and it was only once Implacable had finished that a lot of people were shifted over to accelerate the construction of Vanguard. So there's manpower shortages did hit the British shipbuilding effort pretty hard pretty quickly. There were ways they could have gotten around it, but you know, they had a lot of other issues to solve as well. The thing is, the Germans weren't building all that many, so their manpower shortages were somewhat lessened. The Italians did have some manpower shortages when it came to repair and refit. The Japanese definitely had manpower shortages on repair, refit, and building new ships. The Americans are pretty much the only ones who didn't run into that issue in any major way for quite a while. The Americans actually, realistically, the US, they actually began to run into resource issues preventing the construction of more ships before they ran into manpower shortage issues. Brian Rediman, did anyone use or experiment with tracers on large naval guns? Thank you, Oversoul, by the way. They didn't need to, by and large, because you could usually actually watch the shells. For example, in the battle with Bismarck, King George V and Rodney's crews were watching the shells all the way in to hitting Bismarck, and quite often they were picking up and seeing Bismarck shells initially when Bismarck was firing back coming in. Similarly, when Washington and South Dakota were engaging Japanese ships at the beginning of the Second Night Battle of Guadalcanal, they were watching the shells in the night, glowing as they went up through the cloud layer, and then come back through the cloud layer, watching them drop back down again. So, yeah, the existing setup, the way naval shells worked already, meant that you could pretty much watch them almost as if they were tracers. I mean, that's one of the reasons why when you look at some of the night action shots from various fights, especially the actions around Guadalcanal and Surigao Strait, the long exposure shot, you just see all these bright lines going everywhere, and that's main battery gunfire, obviously caused by a effectively heat source that you can track, and they kind of functions as tracer without actually needing tracer. Then we've got Jerry Thill asks, after seeing that Matt Easton also watches your channel. Yes, I saw that. That was quite. I was like, yay, because I really like watching Matt Easton's channel. And you watch his. You guys need to do a British naval weapons and equipment collaboration on the deck of Victory. Yeah, we do. I can think of one or two other people who'd like to bring along for that one. Yeah, that would be exceptionally fun. I would laugh a lot. And okay, I'll say straight up, Matt Easton is going to be a much better swordsman than I am. But I'm not too shabby a swordsman, having done HEMA in the more distant past and medieval reenactment more recently. So in theory, with the right safety equipment, we could even do, if he's up for it, we could even do a naval saber or cutlass fight across the deck of Victory. I think the Royal Navy Dockyard would probably have conniptions about the safety implications of that, but it's worth asking. That'd be quite funny. Now I want to email him and ask if he's up for that, because yeah, that would be hilarious. Nihon asks, was the overall situation of the Regia Marina during what was the overall situation of the Regia Marina during the interbellum period, and what challenges did it face? The single biggest challenge the Regia Marina faced during the interwar period was money, because they had a lot of monetary situation problems. To give you some idea, the Washington Naval Treaty set a displacement limit for the Italian Navy and the French Navy, as well as the Japanese Royal and US Navies. The Regia Marina started off obviously near enough at that limit, with some early permission to build new capital ships. They went below that limit because they almost immediately got rid of all their pre-dreadnoughts, and then in the 1920s, as they faced further cash issues, they got rid of Dante Alighieri, their first dreadnought, and they gave up on the idea of repairing Leonardo da Vinci. So they actually went well under their displacement allocation. It was only later, post Great Depression, when Mussolini ended up in charge, that the Navy started receiving more funding, and then they basically had to play catch up. This is why there was kind of this unofficial détente with France, where they were going, okay, well, we won't build if you won't build. But then once France started building in response to the Germans, then the Italians, because the French, although the French weren't specifically building against the Italians, because the French naval capability was increasing, they then had to go and upgrade their own fleet, and then the French started reacting to that, which meant the Italians had to react to the French reaction, and it kind of all started escalating, which was just hilarious. Aaron Ray, if Camel Laird's asked you to make a sexy ship calendar, which ships would you choose? Well, so that's 12 ships, isn't it? So that's going to be, well, my favourite capital ships, Hood and New Mexico. I'm probably also going to stick Ark Royal on there. That's 3. Let's think. Richelieu, Wichita. What's the... I don't want to get it wrong again. Bolzano, that's it. Yeah, the Italian cruiser Bolzano. I think that's going up there. That's another 3, I think. Then what else are we going to put on there? Probably one of the French contre-torpilleurs. Then what else are we going to put on there? Probably a tribal. Well, who else made very nice looking... Oh, Tashkent. Tashkent's definitely going on there. So that's the destroyer side of things covered. Renown, definitely. I kind of like the Alaskas. I'll put the Alaskas on there and the Dunkirk. There you go. There's 12. Sage of Irrelevance. Warspite in New Zealand have a secret love child. What manner of ship is it and what is its career? It's fast. It's ridiculously heavily armed. And its career involves it basically never dying no matter what you shoot at it. So it's probably going to be... It's probably going to be the theoretical 28-knot Queen Elizabeth variant. And yeah, believe it or not, we have actually managed to track down where that comes from. It actually comes from a discussion that Jellicoe was having with the former and current Director of Naval Construction in the immediate aftermath of World War I, when they're talking about HMS Hood, and the fact that HMS Hood is the first full-on capital ship in the Royal Navy with small tube boilers, and the current Director of Naval Construction is basically saying this is one of the reasons why Hood's been able to go so fast. And Jellicoe has a bit of a grumble of, backed up by the previous DNC, where he's basically saying, well, I wanted to put small tube boilers in the Queen Elizabeths, and the various manufacturers and shipbuilders that I went to said, oh, no, it can't be done, it won't offer much improvement, etc. And so I didn't. I went with the standard ones, and I really wish I had done. And the previous DNC is basically like, yeah, I know. And when you asked me to do the calculations, and now this kind of is proven with Hood's power density, that I could have got the Queen Elizabeth up to 28 knots. So, and everyone's like, well, that was a missed opportunity that sucks. So, yeah, so at that point, maybe like, I don't know, combine that with the 10-gun Queen Elizabeth design that was examined for a while. So yeah, Warspite in New Zealand's child is probably a Queen Elizabeth variant with 10 guns laid out Iron Duke style, i.e. with a Q turret and midships, with small tube boilers that just cruises around at 28 knots and slaughters everything in sight whilst bouncing everything. So and then probably gets refitted with modern modern boiler. I mean, given the sheer amount of plot armor that thing's carrying, it probably gets refitted with all modern 4.5-inch guns, all new machinery, etc., in the late 1930s, and then goes on to single-handedly slaughter Bismarck at Denmark Strait because it can catch up with it, and it cannot be hit, and it can always hit at ridiculously long range. So, Grey Ghost pointing out, yes, Warspite got hit by a Fritz X bomb, and it lived. Roma got hit by a Fritz X bomb and didn't. So yeah. Quinn the Q asks, Isoroku Yamamoto loses a third finger and is discharged. Now what? I think I answered that one, didn't I? I think I answered that one. If I didn't, please let me know somewhere. So I'm just ticking off the questions that I have answered. Copy. There we go. Scooter JSP, if the Bureau of Ordnance had immediately went to work to resolve the problems with the Mark 14s as soon as reports came in from the front, how early could the US have had working torpedoes? Okay, so there's multiple layers of issues with especially with the Mark 14. So if they'd done some, there's two separate lines. So if they'd done the deep running tests, that could have been solved almost immediately to a certain degree by just adjusting the valves. Not the valves, adjusting the is the hydrostatic valves that would keep the thing that adjust where it should be doing depth keeping. So that could have been solved in a few weeks with some quick testing. Okay, we need to change that, etc. But then what else could we do? In terms of the Mark 6 exploder, realistically, you could probably make something that could be done as an in-field repair. You could probably develop that if they immediately went into testing and realised what the problem is, probably in about a month or two. Then you've got to disseminate how to do it and work on a more permanent solution. So maybe realistically 3 to 4 months to disseminate a temporary stopgap solution that would make the Mark 6 somewhat more reliable. And then in terms of rolling out a new exploder or a full fix that makes it properly reliable again, with the manufacturing you'd have to do for that probably 6 to 8 months, but you would have, I'd say you'd probably you'd dramatically improve the reliability of the torpedoes within 4 to 6 months, and then get them up to fully operational working within a year. Sail away 28 knots with a force 8 following sea, maybe. I'm just going by what the DNC and Admiral Jellicoe said. They basically just ran the numbers based on what Queen Elizabeth's hull form was, what the power output was, and what the power output could have been with small tube boilers taking up the same space. They reckon they could get Queen Elizabeth up to 28 knots. So, if they said that, yeah. Mike G, would you do a video about the 1989 to 90 Pepsi Navy? Again, way past my time period. Might be fun as a side issue or something, but not as the main thing. UK, I don't know how to pronounce that, asks why would the Aegis system be so overpowered if it was sent back through time, even though everyone here seems to agree it would be sunk quickly. I mean, basically, it's not so much the Aegis system itself, because you've got limited numbers of missiles, and there's a lot of aircraft in on most engagements. The two biggest problems, if you're sending back some kind of Aegis ship, is that most Aegis ships also have modern sonar, so that means hunting World War II submarines is going to become suddenly very, very easy. But more to the point, you've got CIWS, and whilst modern 20mm CIWS may not be the world's greatest anti-missile system these days, a couple of 20mm phalanxes will just chew through incoming World War II era aircraft as quickly as you can feed it ammunition. And I mean, the deck guns are gonna probably do a similar job. The missiles you can keep back for, well, if it's an Aegis ship with, yeah, maybe doing some surface action with the missiles, taking out enemy escorts and such, but yeah, the missiles are almost secondary to just piling 20mm ammo into the into the phalanxes. Nihon also asks, what was the situation of the Yugoslavian Navy in the interbellum? Complicated. Very, very complicated. To be honest, they didn't have all that much by World War II. I haven't looked at the Yugoslavian Navy in a massive amount of detail, but they almost, or at least their immediate predecessors, they almost had most of the Austro-Hungarian Navy before the Allies called time on that particular deception. But their main issue during the interwar period was basically, we have no money. The Yugoslavian government had apparently better things to do, so you ended up with a very small navy. Although its story, for all its small size, its story is actually quite interesting, so I will at some point have to cover it in a video at somewhere along the line. Nerd Caveman says, I sent you a question on Discord. Okay. Lots. He says, a lot of alternate history questions that get asked of you involve modern warships or fighting vehicles transported back in time, but what about the logistics side of things? If the US gets 747s and C-130s, Germany gets Airbus, the hovercraft that commute across the English Channel for the UK, all countries get supermassive cargo ships, etc. Assuming 6 months of fuel, small set of spare parts and necessary manuals are provided. Vehicles show up without crews. Crews don't have enough future knowledge to constitute actionable intelligence. 6 months of fuel, spare parts and necessary manuals. Well, to be perfectly honest, the hovercraft would be quite useful, especially for something like D-Day, but also for something like raids, because they're very fast. The supermassive cargo ships are probably a bigger boon to the Allies, but only in certain circumstances. So they're going to want to put them into the very heavily guarded convoys on the Atlantic to move massive amounts of supplies. The main problem is that whilst by World War II periods they'd probably be classed as fast merchants, they are still hilariously vulnerable targets and not especially fast. So yeah, operating them in like the Mediterranean is just painting a socking great target on them. So they're probably not going to be used for that. Although the Italians don't really have much of a choice because they are in the Mediterranean. The Germans would probably put them on Swedish iron ore runs. That's about the safest place they can put them. And I say the British and the Americans are going to put them on very, 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 very heavily guarded transatlantic runs. They will help generally, although I think a lot of them are probably going to end up at the bottom of the ocean or very heavily damaged. But yeah, the C-130, 747s, Airbuses, etc., if they've only got a certain amount of fuel, a certain set of spare parts and manuals, whilst they would be very helpful in certain logistics, I rather suspect they'd almost immediately get hauled off and converted into some kind of super heavy bomber aircraft to make the best use of a limited amount of flight time, especially given that most of them can fly higher and faster than like 747 easily outflies anything that's going to be put up against it. So configure it as a strategic bomber rather than a transport vessel. Right, catching up. Sorry, just skipped again, so I'm scrolling back up again. Scooter JSP, if Prince of Wales has been sunk along with Hood, what would the implications for the Royal Navy have been short term and long term? Short term, there's no Force Z, because you can't send Force Z if you don't have the battleship to send with it. Long term, depends how it's been sunk. If it's gone up like Hood, there's going to be some serious questions asked about physics apart from anything else. Whereas if it's just been battered into submission by Bismarck and sunk in a more conventional manner, apart from raising some issues about how whether or not King George V can stand up to Bismarck and whether they need two instead of one, a conventional sinking is probably not going to change all that much, because ultimately, in reality, Prince of Wales ends up getting sunk at the end of the year anyway. So that doesn't change the things too much. If there's some kind of catastrophic method of loss, then the Royal Navy is going to be very seriously examining Anson and Howe and trying to figure out if they can change anything. And King George V will probably be brought in for a refit as well. L. Jesus asks, how many calibers long should the ideal 5-inch gun be for both effective anti-aircraft and anti-surface engagements? In World War II, the 5-inch 38 is pretty much the perfect balance. If you're talking about see, they managed to bring a longer than 50 cal version out for midways, and would have been on the Montanas, which would have been a lot better. I mean, the thing is, ideally, a longer barrel is better for both, because longer barrel for anti-surface action gives you longer range and greater striking power, and for anti-aircraft work it gives you longer range, which is always useful, and also higher muzzle velocity, which means it gets there quicker. That's the last of the Iron Brew, so we are now on Iron Brew time. It's less about to be honest, it's less about the ideal barrel length, because the ideal barrel length is 50 to 60 calibers long. It's about, do you have the mounting to support it? If the mounting that can support it can elevate and move it around fast enough, despite as a 50 to 60 caliber weapon it's quite a heavy gun, then you want the longer weapon. If you don't have a mounting that can support that kind of movement and tracking, then you need to shorten the barrel until your mounting can keep up with it. Captain C4 asks, in the same vein, how do you think Quiberon Bay with pre-dreadnoughts would have gone? Because I mentioned a novel about refighting Trafalgar with pre-dreadnoughts. Quiberon Bay would have gone hilariously badly with pre-dreadnoughts, because moving at even higher speeds in a storm with lots of rocks around, I can guarantee you that would have led to a lot of sinkings. Cody 85, if the USA and Canada go to war in 1915, what would the brown water navies of both sides look like as they fight in the Great Lakes in eastern Canada? Probably start off with a lot of redeployed colonial gunboats from the on the British side of things, and it's not going to follow quite the same pace of ship development as you see in the War of 1812, part because ships take a lot longer to build, and also, in 1915 the Royal Navy has a lot of much bigger, nastier things to worry about on the other side of the Atlantic. But I suspect you would have started off with gunboat battles, then the gunboats would have got heavier and increasingly implausible looking armaments. Then someone would have started building bigger gunboats so that the implausible looking armaments don't look quite so implausible and they can have more guns, and you would have just had this escalation up and up and up, with possibly someone throwing the odd submarine in there as well. Shinano, Frank Sposato asks, Shinano versus Iowa, Bismarck, Littorio, Richelieu, King George V, carrier conversions, just as a carrier, not fighting each other. Which battleship shot down the most aircraft? I suspect it's probably going to be Iowa, considering it was, excuse me, clothes moth. They get in at night because I got the window open. So which battleship shot down the most aircraft? Probably Iowa, because it served in the Pacific. Bismarck was only around for one voyage. Littorio's anti-aircraft guns weren't particularly brilliant. Richelieu, again, not particularly long war career, although it did spend in the Pacific. And King George V, again, not as heavily engaged with aircraft. So Iowa's probably got, of those, has probably got the most aircraft shot down. Carrier conversion battle of those, well, it's going to be Iowa. It's by far the largest, and they actually had plans for Iowa carrier conversion. So it's going to be the largest. It's going to be one of the fastest. So it's going to be carrying the most aircraft, and it's going to have a lot of aircraft. I mean, Shinano, if it was converted into a full-on carrier as opposed to a maintenance and support carrier, might carry more aircraft, but by the time we're talking about, then Iowa's aircraft are going to be considerably better. Ed Gee, do you think the Chinese Navy will surpass or equal the US? That's modern. See bilge pumps if you want to know my answer to that in more detail, but basically, maybe. It depends on how much money each side is supposed to is going to want to actually pay. Seas asks, and I'm going to have to modify this question to make sure that YouTube doesn't come down our necks like a ton of bricks. But Seas asks, how did people deal with their urges during the age of sail? No women, no privacy at sea for months. How was it managed? Variety of methods, but believe it or not, there were a small number of women present on a lot of age of sail ships, despite all the regulations saying that you couldn't have them. Obviously, there's a reason sailors have a reputation for going a little bit hog wild in port when they get shore leave. But some of it was basically being worked to the bone at all waking hours, so you really didn't have much time to think of anything else because you just want to sleep. Some of it was, of course, just looking at your fellow sailors in a new light, and as I say, some of it was there were some women around, which was, I guess, good for that aspect of things from one perspective for some of the men. As far as no privacy, again, from what the accounts seem to indicate, eventually privacy can, like, if people wait long enough and they have the opportunity, the privacy concerns tend to drop quite significantly. Charles Petit asks, if Queen Elizabeth had been given small tube boilers, how would it affect their service in World War II? It would actually make quite a bit of a difference, I think, because the Queen Elizabeth probably would have been put in hand for modernisation either earlier or with more of them. Because if you've got a baseline 28 knot speed, let's say it's dropped a couple of knots in the interwar period, but you can bring it back up and maybe even slightly more with modern machinery, plus refits of the other equipment. Well, you then have ships that can match the speed of your new treaty era capital ships like the King George V. So if they can match the speed, and they've got nearly as good belt armor, then there's probably a lot more incentive to try and rationalize the belt armor, take off some of the distributed armor scheme belt plates, and beef up the deck armor, pretty much what they did to Queen Elizabeth and Valiant, and to a slightly lesser extent Warspite, and give them the elevated 30-degree elevation guns, better fire control and radar, basically everything they did to them, plus the machinery refits, and maybe even a bit more armor, and then they would have had a full-on frontline service. And with that advantage present, I think Barham and Malaya would also have got modernized, which, I mean, you'd probably then see the Queen Elizabeths, I was going to say all in the Mediterranean, but actually I think maybe not. They definitely wouldn't be on convoy escort duty. I think basically you'd see the R's moved exclusively to convoy escort duty, and then some of the Queen Elizabeths would be in the Mediterranean as a fast squadron, but they'd also be keeping a couple of the best ones, maybe the ones that have been most recently refitted, with the home fleet until enough King George V's have come online, because they're fast enough and theoretically capable enough to go chasing after almost any German capital ship. Nosdoomer89, if you're going to write an alternate history novel, what would you write about, and what would your point of divergence be? Depends how ambitious I want to be. If I want to be super ambitious, I'd write something about the proposed Imperial Federation with a point of departure of about 1890. If I was going to be somewhat more practical in my alternate history, where would I write? I'd probably write about a massive war kicking off in the 1880s. So just so I can write about the hilarious collection of ironclads having a knockdown, drag-out fight. Kevin Kennelly asks, you've had that CR-90 Corellian Corvette behind you forever. Do you fly X-Wing? I used to play X-Wing, yes. I have a bunch of other X-Wing miniatures, but the Corvette is my favourite. Then... well, I lost... Where's that going? Brian Rediman asks, Megascrow asks, in warfare for reasons, a fleet of my light cruisers have to be fitted with rapid 110cm guns. How dangerous would 180 of those a minute be? I presume 180... I'm going to assume you mean 110 millimeters, because 110 centimeters... That's... big. You're not going to get a rapid fire 110 centimeter gun. Yeah, that's not happening. You basically had just one massive... In fact, I don't even think you could get a 110 centimeter gun on a light cruiser without breaking it. Assuming you mean 110 millimeter gun, so talking just over 4 inches, light cruiser with 180 round per minute, just over 4-inch guns. I mean, it would be an absolutely hilariously lethal anti-destroyer and anti-air cruiser. You'd need to make it quite big. I think you'd probably have to make it like treaty cruiser max 10,000 ton size, just to be able to fit enough ammunition inside, so that you're not going to run out of ammunition inside the first 30 seconds of your engagement. But yeah, you'd basically create the world's most lethal AA and... you'd create the world's most lethal anti-aircraft cruiser and death to destroyers. About the only problem with engaging cruisers would be a just over 4-inch gun isn't going to have the range, apart from anything else. There's someone in someone who speaks German saying, "I can help you with translation if I get the documents." Say, beware what you wish for. I have a 5-volume series that on the Kriegsmarine that's all in Gothic font German. I do believe that is technically a form of torture, but oh well. Smiling need 110cm guns. There are light cruiser weapons in battle with Gothic. Yeah, probably. Wouldn't surprise me if they're like the Gatling barrels on a Warlord Titan's Gatling blaster. Christopher Filkhead, I think, asked, are you going to do a video on the Cylander affair? I did actually mention the Cylander affair to a reasonable degree in one of the dry docks, a few dry docks back, but yes, it is, again, it's one of those smaller naval incidents that definitely does need to be covered in a video at some point. But again, as I say, you don't want to see the Wednesday video list. I mean, I've got like 3 or 4 more videos on Vasa to do. Hopefully then one of those will be coming in the next couple of weeks. Box Ghost 102. In the game From the Depths, my buddy built a battleship with 4 quadruple 510mm turrets, 10 twin automatic 210mm turrets. So that's what, automatic just over 8-inch and hilarious inch guns. Assuming World War II shipbuilding techniques, what's the displacement of this monster? 510. How much is 510mm in inches? 20. So 12 20-inch guns mounted in, no, actually more than that, 16 20-inch guns in quad turrets. The Super Yamatos, the A150s, were going to have 6. So about 120,000 tons. Which is just hilarious. How much better would the US Navy have been, this is Stephen Laguerre, in World War II without the Washington Naval Treaty, and what would its capital ship composition have been? That's an interesting one. Well, capital ship composition, instead of most of the standards, you're probably going to be, well, it's going to be the 1920 South Dakota design, the Lexingtons, which is interesting because it means the US is going to have a bunch of Lexington battle cruisers, and given their predilection towards actually historically not particularly modernizing the ships, no aircraft carrier variants of the Lexington. So they're probably actually going to have, assuming the treaty, actually without the Washington Treaty restrictions, I don't know what carrier designs they're going to come up with, but they're going to have, 6 Lexingtons, 6 1920 South Dakotas, plus the follow-ons to that, to those. So you're going to have probably something along the lines of 10 to 12 fast battle cruisers, half of which might actually, stand up to anything more than a stiff breeze, and then you're going to have your 6 South Dakota 1920 designs, which are going to be very, very heavy, somewhat slow, and then depends what the follow-on design to that is. Depends if it's quicker or not. They're going to have a lot more fast carrier escorts, because the Lexingtons and whatever the follow-on battle cruisers happen to be. But the 1920 South Dakotas are probably going to run into the same problem as the standards did historically, which is that they're just going to be too slow to operate with the carriers. But assuming that they've got some. The main problem is you're going to end up with like Amagis and Keys and Tosas all over the place as well, which isn't going to help matters much. But in terms of pure carrier operations, the US Navy will be better off. In terms of actual battle line, the Japanese are going to have a lot more fast battleships and heavily armoured and armed battle cruisers, so it probably would balance out overall. Whiskey Delta Gophos Warspite with rapid fire 110 centimeter guns versus the 1944 US Navy. Even Warspite, I mean, that's just, as someone pointed out, it's like bigger than Schwerer Gustav. I'm just going to ask, what is 110 centimeters in inches? 43.3 inches. I mean, Warspite with a 43-inch gun. Yeah, you're probably talking like a couple of forward fixed mounts. So it's not going to last very long against the entire 1944 US Navy, but whatever it hits is just going to go kaboom. If it doesn't just go straight through and out the other side. I mean, to be honest, if you've got a 110 centimeter rapid fire gun, I mean, apart from being a fixed spinal mount, you'd probably have to make sure you've lined up 3 or 4 US battleships in this particular scenario in a row, because it's going to probably punch through the first 3 before the fuse initiates. Direwolf 1618. Where is the sea mine? It is missed. The sea mine is currently asleep. Chris Bruce asks, the US made 18-inch guns that fired 18-inch super heavy shells as a test. How effective would these 18-inch shells be against Yamato's armor? Possibly slightly more effective than the 16-inch 50s, but it's probably not massively more so, because when they evaluated the 16-inch 50, a theoretical 16-inch 55 and the 18-inch, they concluded that the performance in terms of armor penetration of the 18-inch sat somewhere between the 16-inch 50 and the 16-inch 55. So they're going to have somewhat better penetration than the 16-inch 50, but not a tremendous amount more. And you're going to have fewer gun barrels, which is why, in the end, the US went with one of the many reasons why the US went for 12 16-inch guns on the Montana. Although they weren't specifically designing against the Yamato, it was the general principle of marginally more armor penetration versus having to lose like a third of your guns. Plasma Burn Death asking, did any nation try biological shells in World War II, like with bacteria or shrapnel having poison? No, they did. The French did design shells with a gas canister with the ability to insert gas canisters into them, but that didn't work out very well. In fact, it was probably in large part responsible for the various barrel explosions that they had early on in Richelieu's lifetime. But yeah, basically, naval battles are probably one of the areas that are least effective for trying any kind of biological payload, because even if it works, it's not going to work anything like close to quick enough to actually affect the battle in any meaningful way, and any kind of poison that's involved is almost certainly just going to cook off in the explosion, so it's not going to actually, hurt anybody. I mean, and also if you've been hit by shrapnel from a battleship shell, you have more problems to worry about than whether or not the thing was poisoned. Like, where's the rest of me gone? Alexander Stubbs, have you played the game Rule the Waves 2? Yes, I have. I'm now well on my way through my second playthrough. Still not quite got the hang of the aircraft elements, though. need to close the window. The flipping clothes moths are coming. GHK 364. How do you think the 1939 battle between the 2 Dunkirks and the 3 Deutschlands would have gone? The Dunkirks are probably going to win that because, again, they have the range to dictate the range. They have enough armour, certainly for Strasbourg. Yeah, they've probably got decent enough armour to stand up to the Deutschland's gunfire at longer range, and their guns can make a complete mess of the Deutschlands. So yeah, it would probably be very much in favour of the Dunkirks. Olmocap, is there any website where there are detailed blueprints of warships' interior arrangements stored? There are a few around that have some really high quality scans of various warship interior blueprints. The Dreadnought project has a ton of blueprints, a lot of them for the German capital ships, but a few others. I know that one off by heart. There's another Researcher at Large, I think, is the one that's got a ton of US blueprints floating around as well. Those are the two that I remember immediately. USS Grey Ghost, a French Leon class with a slightly modified design of 2-bow and 2-stern super-firing turrets versus the Scharnhorst. If it can find it and keep up with it, which it won't. I mean, it could find it, but it won't be able to keep up with it because it's much too slow. But assuming the Scharnhorst accepted the battle, 16 guns, all of which are considerably heavier than Scharnhorsts, is going to make a mess of the Scharnhorst, assuming that they've modified or refitted the Leon with modern fire control. Origin of One. There's been much commentary about the poor dispersion of Italian gunnery in World War II. Recent studies suggest this has been slightly exaggerated. Could you provide clarity? So as I've mentioned before, the Italian shell dispersion varies. They obviously had some good batches of shells because their dispersion was a lot better in some at some points rather than others. But it's difficult to exaggerate just how bad some of the dispersion was. As I've mentioned before, and as I mentioned on the collab video I did with World War II TV history on Thursday, you can check the community tab for the link to that live stream. When you've got a line of cruisers and you're shooting at one, and your shell dispersion is so wide that there are splashes coming up on the other side of cruisers on either side of you, i.e. a shell dispersion of well over a kilometre, you can't really exaggerate that. It is almost literally couldn't hit a postcode at that range. I think the one exaggeration possibly that's come in is that the Italian accuracy was always like that. It's like, no, it sometimes it was much better than that, but it was completely unreliable and inconsistent. I mean, yeah, again, like say the Giulio Cesare versus Warspite. At one point in that engagement, Giulio Cesare is obviously shooting at Warspite, but at one point manages to, I can't remember whether it's a direct or very, very close miss, but basically manages to inflict damage on a destroyer, again, that is at a completely different range bracket from Warspite because the shell goes so hilariously long, I think it's long in that particular engagement. Yeah, the exaggeration is where people think this is always the case, and I say it's not. The worst cases are the ones that get remembered the most because they are just so hilariously bad. But sometimes a good batch of shells or whatever meant that the shooting was quite close, and also it tended to affect the bigger the ship, the worse the effect seems to have been. Rob Smith pointing out, if you want ship plans, maritime.org /doc/plans is also a growing resource. So there's another good one. Jacob Moss saying, I'm still going, well, this is how much iron brew I've got left. So, Cody85, did the Royal Navy ever design a single mount and or open mount for the 5.25-inch gun? Not a seagoing one that I'm aware of. Seas asks, BAP Almirante Grau was decommissioned in 2017. Would she still have been of use as a warship in recent years? Plus Almirante Grau versus General Belgrano. You can always refit a ship like that. So, I mean, the thing is, for a lot of the time in her service, she's a roughly 10,000-ton cruiser, which means she's bigger and has more space than a considerable number of other ships in service, which means that, yes, she would... I mean, even now, there's relatively few surface combatants that aren't carriers and such, like, that, you know, are much heavier, if at all, than she is. So she's got the space to be refitted to, you know, carry missiles and modern sensors and everything, as well as some of her guns. So yes, she could have been of use, depending on what the refit is. Almirante Grau versus General Belgrano. I suppose that is a question, isn't it? If she's armed with surface missiles, then she probably got the advantage over the Belgrano. I don't know about in a straight-up gunfight. I don't know all that many details about how capable Belgrano was in the Falklands War, apart from the basics. So I suspect, given that Almirante Grau had slightly more modernizations than Belgrano, from what I can see, she'd probably have a slight advantage, but not. I can't really go much further than that. Jacob Moss asks, can we have a quick rundown of everything RMS Olympic hit? Everything RMS Olympic hit and quick rundown are not synonymous in any way, shape or form. That's... she hit a Royal Navy cruiser for one. I think she hit not a lighthouse, a light ship as well. I think they've probably run down a fishing ship at one point. Also. But no, at some point I do have to do that sort of comical ships and what they managed to do. RMS Olympic running into everything is definitely one of those. Anton Alert asks, Warspite sucked in dirt before sailing against the Italians. Yes, this was just on the way out to Matapan, I believe. Just how many holes are below a ship's waterline? Quite a few, actually, because you've got various intakes, feed water. You've got pumps, which may or may not be below the waterline, depending on, I don't know, what the sea state is like and where they are on the ship. What else? What other holes below the waterline? You've got valves for valved intakes for the various, like the emergency flooding valves for the magazines and stuff like that. There's a reasonable number of underwater holes. Some of which you really none of which you really want clogged with dirt, but some of you really don't want clogged with dirt. Budguy8829. How would having US fast battleships at Midway affect the battle? Also, what was Admiral King's opinion of Admiral Jellicoe? When I was doing my research on Admiral King, I didn't find all that much. I mean, because the thing is, he came to the UK after Jellicoe was out of command of the Grand Fleet, but he did go with a destroyer with Jellicoe on to witness shore bombardment, and Jellicoe took being shot at pretty well. So as far as I can tell, he seems to have had a relatively positive opinion of Jellicoe as an officer who, went onto the front lines, got stuck into action, and didn't seem to be particularly fazed by any of it. Tyler Kuhn, would the Kriegsmarine have been better off building 3 of the cancelled Ersatz York-class battlecruisers with World War II fire control and engines instead of the 3 Deutschland-class Panzerschiff? I mean, if they could afford it, they'd have considerably more firepower and protection to hand. So, yes. Although, amusingly enough, it would mean that when they built the Scharnhorst, they're actually stepping back down in armament. And then stepping back up again with the Bismarcks. But yeah, I mean, yeah, the Ersatz Yorks, they're bigger. With modern machinery, they would be faster and considerably more heavily armed and considerably better protected than the Deutschland class. So yes, the Kriegsmarine would be better off, at least until someone took a look at the fuel bill. Captain Seafort, given that BT seems to have been fairly competent as long as he stayed on dry land, what role do you think he would have been best suited for in World War One? In World War One, maybe Second Sea Lord? I wouldn't want to give him Third Sea Lord because that would mean he'd actually get a chance to design shipping. But yeah, maybe Second Sea Lord, or yeah, that would probably be the place he can do the best within the context of World War One, because you're not going to make him First Sea Lord in World War One. He's not senior enough at that point. David Wright, will you ever do a video about Thomas Cochrane? Yes, definitely. Right, so since I'm almost out of Iron Brew and it's coming up for 10 o'clock, I'm going to try and get through the last few Super Chat questions, and then we'll see how we run through the rest of these general chat questions as well. I've been trying to bounce back and forth to give everyone a fair shake. Knight6831, how would Belgrano fare against Tiger and Blake? Badly. I mean, okay, Tiger and Blake by the Falklands have just their single forward twin mount instead of 4 and aft twin mounts, but still the amount of 6-inch fire they can put down very rapidly, it would be quite bad for Belgrano. Plus it's 2 targets, so as long as they regulate their fire such that the guns don't jam. Jonathan Blimey, have you seen Battle Stations Pacific Remastered? No, I haven't. It's a mod for an old game from 2009. They even made the invasion of San Francisco. No, I haven't seen that. Well, I've seen it. I think I've seen it advertised and mentioned. I haven't actually played it. Paul from Chicago, will Tribal's Battles and Darings be the greatest book ever written, or only in the top 5? Well, that would be spoilers. I mean, to be fair, even I haven't read it yet, so we shall see, but I suspect it shall be very good. And of course, I will get my copy signed, because I can. Jake Miller, were the Kriegsmarine and Marine Nationale just playing top trumps for most of the time the Nazis were in power? Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, as you say, Germany built the Deutschlands, the French built the Dunkirks, Germany built the Scharnhorst, the French modified Strasbourg and started on the Richelieus, although the Richelieus were partly also in response to not just the Scharnhorst, but also the fact that Germans were planning on the Bismarcks and the Italians were building the Littorios. So yeah, it's all over the place. Age or Arge, maybe? Styro asks, how would the Battle of Narvik have gone if Norge and Eidsvold had been dreadnoughts? It depends what kind of dreadnoughts, because the visibility was so awful in that battle that the range basically obviates almost all of a dreadnought's advantages against destroyers. And it's the torpedoes that do in Norge and Eidsvold more than anything else. The visibility is so bad they can't even support each other. The Norge doesn't even see the German destroyers coming through the harbour entrance it is guarding. That's how bad the visibility is. But if we assume that they are sort of period dreadnoughts for when they're built, so first, second generation dreadnoughts or so, and if we assume that they've been heavily bulged for in like refits at some point, then it could go very differently. I mean, Eidsvold just opening up as a dreadnought with its main guns and secondary guns, which it would be able to do without having to speed up and close the range, that will probably inflict quite a bit of damage on the German destroyers. And even if it then gets torpedoed horribly and goes down, when if Norge sees German destroyers, again, it's got so many more guns at that point and is a much more stable firing platform, it could probably badly damage or sink a number of German destroyers there until it gets torpedoed. If they've both been heavily bulged, sort of HMS Glatten style, then they might just eat a few torpedoes and keep on firing, and they could end up damaging or destroying the entire German force. It's really going to depend on how good their torpedo defences are. Yang M, how much does it cost to raise a ship versus how much is the ship is worth to scrap? Remembering back in a previous guide you mentioned a ship was sunk, then raised and sold for scrap. It depends where the ship has sunk. If the ship has, quote-unquote, sunk, as in it is no longer afloat, but it's kind of sunk 6 foot to the bottom of a harbour that it's in, then, and also, I mean, depending on how much damage, like, was it one big hole, is it multiple holes, etc. So if it's sunk in harbour in shallow water with maybe 1 or 2 major breaches, it's not that expensive to raise it, and therefore you will make a fair amount of profit raising it and then selling it off for scrap. Whereas if it's been blown into tiny pieces and it's several miles down like Hood is, like Wargrave aside, it's never good. You're going to spend vastly more money ever retrieving like any significant amount of it than you're ever going to get back from scrap value and everything in between. So the Scapa flow wrecks are a relatively good example. In fact, the Scapa flow wrecks pretty much show you where that dividing line is, because some of the Scapa flow wrecks from the High Seas Fleet, they sank in relatively deep waters, but not too deep. Some sank in very shallow waters, and where they sunk in sort of shallowish to medium to mid-depth water and settled on in hole in a relatively easy to access position, those were considered commercially viable to pick up, salvage, take away and scrap, and people making profit off of them. Whereas some of the others that are still there, they sank in slightly deeper water and at slightly odder angles, and despite the fact they're in the same location, they were judged as not commercially viable for salvage. So that if you look at the various Scapa flow wrecks and which ones were and weren't salvaged, that pretty much is the dividing line between where does it become commercially cost effective to salvage and scrap something as opposed to just leaving it there. And that's with obviously relatively minimal hull damage. Squirrel Jenkins, assuming the Axis adequately play a smarter intelligence game, do the Allies still win World War II without the intel advantage? They've still got a massive preponderance of force. So yes, in theory, yes, they will, because they've just got much more industry behind them. The losses will be higher, but they can do it. And secondly, atomic bombs do not care for your intel. The longer the war goes on, the more likely it is that either the RAF or the USAAF just goes, you know what, Yeah, we might not have made it much out of France or whatever with our delayed D-Day invasion, but we can erase your cities on a weekly basis until you give up, and then the Axis has to give up. That's kind of the way atomic bombs go. Ryan Friedrich, favourite naval painting? Top 3 and honourable mentions? Favourite naval painting? Top 3. Okay, within my top 3, I would say there's... I can't remember for the life of me what the name of it is right now. But basically, one of the few remaining actually nice attractions at the National Maritime Museum is an absolutely huge, like, 2-story painting of Victory in the middle of the Battle of Trafalgar, i.e. HMS Victory. And there's just so much detail painted into that. I mean, it does help when you're, doing a painting the size of the side of a house. You can include a lot of detail in there, but that is one of my favourite naval paintings. What other naval paintings? There's a series of paintings. Again, I don't even know what they're called or even what book they're from. I featured a couple of screenshots of them in some of my videos, but there's some really dramatic paintings of Japanese World War II warships in battle. They're painted very dark, almost black, with most of the emphasis being on the fire going on around them. That's definitely in my top 3, just from the dramatic action element. And again, because it appeals to me on the level of just sheer amount of detail, again, I don't know exactly what it's called, but there's a big painting of, I believe it's the Battle of Granville, during the Spanish Armada's attempt to invade the UK or England at that point, I guess. And again, they've just painted all these different actions and all these different ships, and I just like those kinds of paintings where someone's not just trying to convey a particular scene, but where they're trying to convey an entire battle and an entire sense of what's going on. So those would be my top 3. But I mean, just honourable mentions. There's loads of really good naval paintings out there. Nagato 2044. Why did the Japanese replace Nagato and Mutsu's secondary guns with secondary gun turrets in 1935? That did or didn't? I don't know. Did I think you mean did by the end of their careers? So why did they replace? I don't know what vor means. VOOR. I guess that means with. Does that mean with? What does that mean? Vor in English. In front of? For? Prior to? In front of? Secondary guns. I'm going to guess it means secondary guns with secondary gun turrets in 1935. Why did they replace them? Because casement guns are awful as dual-purpose weapons, basically. Yeah, basically. The IJN wanted to have dual-purpose secondary batteries, and to have dual-purpose secondary batteries, you needed to have turreted or deck-mounted weapons. Casements can't do it, and also casements have proved themselves by that point to be far too low and unwieldy in almost all cases, so it just made sense to replace them with deck-mounted guns that A, you could use in most weathers, and B, actually had some function against enemy aircraft. Tevildo pointing out, yes, the National Maritime Museum painting is just called The Battle of Trafalgar by Turner. Well, yeah, not particularly original, but makes sense, I guess. Kaiju director Aubrey or Hornblower, what are your favourite books from either series? I'd have to do a video on that because there are a lot of books in both series. And to be honest, it's been several years since I read them. Emperor Dave, Washington Treaty takes place later, so G3, N3 and other country ships at the same time period are built. What happens and what effect on the treaty in World War II? Well, the two main effects, again, this is a fairly common question. The two main effects are going to be, one, the Washington Treaty is going to have to specify 18 inches and 45,000 tons or thereabouts as the actual treaty displacement limit for future battleships. The effects on World War II are going to be twofold. One of which is that you've got the slower battleships, N3, South Dakota, etc. They're still going to be around, very heavily armed, very heavily armoured. They're going to inform the treaty battleships because you've got to have something that vaguely matches them, except hopefully a bit faster now. But they're going to be some pretty major threats. Yamato, the Japanese have to take into account like fighting two N3s or two 1920 South Dakotas. So Yamato's just going to be hilariously large if they choose to go down that route. And the main thing is that with things like the G3s and the Lexingtons around, if they're modernised and refitted, you now have some very fast battleships, which, especially with something like the G3, that might also influence treaty battleships into actually being 30 knot or so ships rather than 28 knot, because G3 is going to be cruising around with good armour, good guns and high speed, so why would you build less unless you're really dedicated to 18-inch guns, I guess. Nick Walters, thank you very much. Right, okay, so I'm going to wrap it up with 2 or 3 more questions, because one, having left the window open to try and cool the room down earlier, it's now getting absolutely freaking freezing in here, and I need to go close that. And 2, I'm now out of Iron Brew, which is very sad, and I do need to get to sleep soon, because I'm going to be spending an entire day airsofting tomorrow, and given that, well, it's been interesting amounts of rain today, I suspect I'm probably going to be reenacting What If the Somme, except with automatic weapons. If I do drown in mud, I do apologise. Blogs, would we have saved much on refitting the Nelsons if we reused the 6-inch turrets? And thank you again, NASA. What would we reuse them on, is the question. I guess we could stick them on some cruisers, maybe. Yeah, I think it's what are you going to reuse the 6-inch turrets on to be? It would be the big question, and also what you're putting in place of them. Let's have a look. USS Grey Ghost, can you tell us more about the German flak U-boats? Yeah, again, something for a video. But generally speaking, when it comes to the flak U-boats, they were a German attempt to solve the problem of Allied patrol aircraft with radar and such like becoming considerably more effective over the Bay of Biscay, because to get out to their actual hunting grounds, the U-boats had to cross the Bay of Biscay. If you do that submerged, it's going to take forever and a day, and you're going to have to surface anyway to recharge your batteries several times. Running on the surface, you can do it a lot quicker and with a lot more comfort, but you're now at risk of surface attack, but your attack on the surface by aircraft. So the flak boats were an attempt to try and get the Allied aircraft to go away, because you don't expect a U-boat to have particularly heavy flak armament, so the idea was stick a bunch of flak guns on a U-boat. The aircraft that can get out to the Bay of Biscay aren't exactly the world's most agile, or indeed the swiftest, so when they come in to drop depth charges, which are obviously fairly close-range weapons on what they think is a lightly armed U-boat, then the U-boat opens up and tears it apart with flak, sends the aircraft down in flames or badly damages it, and that depletes the number of long-range anti-submarine patrol aircraft the Allies have, and hopefully they stop trying to kill you quite as often. It kind of worked for a little bit because yeah, the Allies didn't expect it, but then once they learned to expect it, the Allies in turn would take countermeasures to either sneak up on the subs or hit them from longer ranges, deploy other kinds of aircraft, and sometimes even get involved in shootouts with the flak boats from slightly longer ranges. So it was kind of very good idea for a short period of time, then not so good idea, then actually a terrible idea because it meant that you were stuck on the surface and then you were a very easy target to damage. So it very rapidly lost its utility and they basically gave up on the idea relatively quickly. Michael O'Brien, all US carriers at the Battle of Midway are replaced with USS Midway. How does the battle go? Assuming it's USS Midway in 1945, it depends what aircraft it's coming with. If you've got USS Midway circa 45-46 with her circa 45-46 air group, then, you know, the torpedo bombers actually have a chance. The dive bombers are the dive bombers. Their navigation and operational skills will be a lot better. The fighters are considerably better as well. There's just not as many of them, but made up for by their slightly increased the increase in individual lethality. So that would be an interesting one to try and call. See, I'm not sure Midway, even with her 1945-46 air group, I'm not sure Midway could kill quite as many carriers as the sheer number of US aircraft at the historical Battle of Midway could. But maybe I'm being too pessimistic. I think it's going to depend a lot on how many casualties they take at the start, because the thing is that fewer aircraft, there are still lots of Japanese fighters, and whilst the US fighters are considerably better, Helldivers and Avengers and possibly not Devastators. I've forgotten what the very late war US torpedo bombers were, the ones that were supposed to replace the Avengers. But anyway, they're still vulnerable to the Japanese fighters. So, yeah. Could go either way. I don't even know how to pronounce that because it's a series of symbols, but whoever that is asks, without naval treaties restricting naval construction, would the age of the battleship have lasted longer? Not that much longer, but possibly slightly longer, because they would have been so big, they would have been a lot harder to kill. I mean, just look at the absolute pounding that Yamato and Musashi took. So if they've all gotten up to that kind of size, the sheer difficulty in killing them, especially when you're talking about something like a British or US battleship that's just covered in 20mm and 40mm and radar guided anti-air, etc., they might appear to have a utility against air attacks that would last considerably longer in the war. But even with that said, the advent of guided anti-shipping munitions towards the end of the war probably would have put the timer on them anyway. There you go, Selwyn. That's BTD destroyers. Thank you. That's what I was thinking about. It's a problem. Destroyer is very close in concept to Devastator. Jake, if Midway was at Midway, what would it have been cool? Because Midway was named after the Battle of Midway. This is true. I'm assuming it's time traveling. Okay, so let's do our last three questions. Let's pick three questions. SR-71 Super Speed. Which other late-era battleship would be best suited for a 1980s Iowa class upgrade? Vanguard, because it's the only other late-era battleship. The South Dakotas are far too small. The North Carolinas are too slow. The Bismarcks are sunk. The Torios were broken up and somewhat short range, with some interesting questions about their armour and underwater protective schemes, and all the Japanese ones were sunk. So basically, Vanguard's the winner by default. Derp Squad, what effect would a 43-inch high explosive shell with contact detonation 1-ton HE warhead have against the hull of a battleship? Nothing good. I mean, that amount of explosive would cause stupid amounts of damage, because at that point you wouldn't even really be, if you're using HE, you wouldn't even be wanting to hit the armour. You'd just be wanting to, I mean, if you've got a base fused 43-inch HE shell and you just smack the superstructure somewhere like near the level of the deck, it'll get far enough in and then detonate. You're basically wiping out like half of the ship's superstructure and pretty much all of its secondary armament in a single massive blast. And the shock from that detonation is probably going to rip up a good chunk of the of everything from there down to the main armor deck. Smiling Nidas, thoughts on the new Sisters of Battle mech plus character? I like them. I would tweak the design a little bit, but it's certainly a step up above the Grey Knight's baby carrier. Yeah, I've seen. I think someone digitized up a kind of Sisters of Battle dreadnought that was basically the same model, except they replaced the Sister of Battle sitting in there with just a kind of almost a Contemptor dreadnought style shell, but in keeping with the model, and with just a big Sister of Battle armoured half head, the same way that you see on some of the various Space Marine dreadnoughts. And I think that looked really good. It looked really, really good. I like the new mech, but I like that version better. So Jules asks, was the Regia Marina an actual problem for the Allies in World War II? Yes. See the Thursday live stream that I did with World War II TV history for that, for a much longer talk about that, because that's pretty much what the entire thing is about. SW, could you do a segment on the scrap iron flotilla? It's on my list of things to do. And okay, very last question I'm gonna do is okay, two-part. Can you do a review about carriers? I've done a number of 5-minute guides about carriers, and I do have a carrier development video series partly done. It's done part of it, and the rest of it's in the works. And the other part, Armando Matos has been asking this for a while. Similar to World War One, if Admiral Lutyens takes Scharnhorst to the Mediterranean in the beginning of 39, so this is kind of like Goeben, and ends up working for the Italians for the rest of the war, how much of an impact would he and the ship have? Lutyens himself, possibly not tremendous amount of impact. As far as the impact of the ship, well, Gneisenau's all on its own, whole thing, which is going to make Operation Berlin slightly less successful, and obviously there's not going to be a battle of North Cape, so that's good for the British on that side of things. But with a fairly capable, if somewhat lightly armed, fast battleship in the mix in the Mediterranean, there are going to be quite a few interesting fights, shall we say. I mean, 39... the one thing is, if he's at the beginning of 39, you've got a period between September 1939 and middle of 1940 when the Italians get involved, when Scharnhorst is basically the only major Axis asset in the Mediterranean. So I would actually put a big question mark over whether Scharnhorst actually survives long enough to join up with the Italians, because there is every opportunity at that point that you probably have renowned Ark Royal, Dunkirk and Strasbourg going hunting for it and trying to run it down. So unless it basically camps in an Italian port, which is going to raise some interesting questions about whether or not the Italians are truly neutral, I can't actually see Scharnhorst keeping herself alive long enough for the Italians to join the war. And Fushi Smith saying, "This is a down payment for the first warship of the Royal Draconian Navy." Okay, thank you very much, I guess. I guess, yes, at that point we probably could buy a warship. It's as if everyone says the same from all the subscribers. We could buy a warship. Yeah, we could. I'm not asking you to, because I have no idea what I'd do with a full-scale warship. Actually, no, I do have some ideas of what I'd do with a full-scale warship. That's probably a very good reason not to send me that kind of money. Yeah, I don't know. Depends. How much do you want the world to end? Quickly goes off to find smallest warship that can be equipped with nuclear weapons. Yeah. T-Hawk 59. Dr. Clark is the one you need to ask about uploading bilge pumps to Apple Pod as well as Simplecast. So, yeah. Direct technical questions about the bilge pumps podcast to Dr. Clark. He's the one who organises where they go on upload. As far as any chance of me doing a separate podcast, I think I've got enough on my plate at the moment. Although I might look at, because I've obviously got the audio files for all my videos, I might look at seeing if I can convert some of the more popular ones into audio only files, if I can find some way of distributing them. So that is going to be it, because I can feel my voice going. It's almost 10:30 here in the UK, and as I said, if I'm not going to get shot to absolute pieces in our recreation of the Somme tomorrow, I do need some sleep. So I'm going to wrap it up there. Thank you very much, everybody, for listening and watching, such as this is. And I shall bid you all adieu and see you again in another video. Dry Dock obviously coming out tomorrow. So see you all next time. Bye, everyone.